The noises that had once filled Jin Castle with screams and the wails of warriors gradually faded into silence. After the fierce battle, the castle stood devastated, its halls heavy with the thick stench of blood. Yi Mok surveyed the aftermath and reflected that the scene was truly dreadful, yet he recognized within his mind that such devastation was only natural, considering that this had been the greatest war ever to erupt in the Jianghu. One of the warriors stepped forward and delivered a report, stating that around 600 martial artists had died, while nearly 1,000 had been injured. He added that a more detailed report would follow once everything had been properly handled. Yi Mok acknowledged the report and gave his approval. Wang Hul looked over the grim results of the battle and remarked on how thoroughly everything had been carried out. Baekji explained that every single captive taken from the berserk saber of the six martial arts sect had been under control through the use of inner energy. According to his account, all of them had died when their heads suddenly exploded. He stated that the parasite within their heads had activated exactly as the Demon Lord had warned. Markham observed the aftermath and considered privately that their enemies had clearly been prepared. Deep within, he questioned why they feared information leaking out to such an extent. Even so, he was certain they had never anticipated that matters would unfold like this. His gaze then shifted toward No Dokyung, whose body was still trembling violently from the lingering shocks. The man's appearance had been completely ruined, his hair had vanished, and even his eyebrows had been burned away to a crisp. Dokyung struggled to speak through his shaking body, accusing the Demon Lord of being a monster while demanding to know how the parasite inside his head had been removed. Markham continued to study the situation, wondering to himself just how much more the Demon Lord was capable of accomplishing. In his mind, he recognized that this man was entirely different from every supreme heavenly demon he had served before. Each action continued to raise his expectations, and deep within his heart grew the hope that the great heavenly demon divine cult might finally achieve all of its goals under this leader. Meanwhile, a final dispute had erupted between the Orthodox Murim Alliance and the demonic cult. Hobum firmly rejected the opposing side's demand. Mo Yong-kong followed with the same refusal, declaring that it had been their own side that had captured the man. Despite the argument, the Orthodox Murim Alliance remained unwilling to surrender Namgung, who stood bound tightly with ropes. The confrontation between the two sides quickly grew tense. Hong Pal-Wu spoke firmly, reminding the demonic cult that alliances were governed by rules. With that reasoning, he argued that it was unreasonable to demand the captives that their side had personally taken. Hobum responded sharply and directed his attention toward the Namgung Patriarch. He reminded the man that he had fled immediately after losing his arm to him. Namgung avoided meeting his gaze and muttered that no such thing had ever occurred. Hobum reacted with mocking disbelief. He ridiculed the man, pointing out that the wound from the severed arm must have burned badly if it had erased the memory so completely, and he openly scorned Namgung for displaying such cowardice. Namgung calmly insisted that he had been captured by Mo Yong-kang and Hong Pal-Wu, maintaining that he had no idea what Hobum was referring to. Despite his outward composure, anxiety stirred deep within Namgung. He realized that if they were handed over to the demonic cult, torture would inevitably follow to extract information about the Blue Heaven Society. Within his mind, he understood that such an outcome would lead to the death of every one of them. As the argument continued, someone remarked that Hobum had been the one who captured the man in the first place. Hobum responded to the call, his irritation beginning to rise. At that moment, Chun Yo-won approached while dragging along the captured No Dokyung. The moment Yo-won appeared before them, the leaders who had been arguing suddenly stiffened. The overwhelming pressure of his true energy weighed heavily on them. Within their thoughts, they struggled against that pressure while convincing themselves that they could not change their decision. They believed that surrendering the captives would expose the corruption within the Orthodox Murim. At heart, they also feared that the demonic cult might discover the dangerous technique connected to the matter and use it for evil, insisting privately that such a technique should belong only to the Orthodox Murim. The leaders of the Murim Alliance then cast meaningful glances toward Yi Mok, the head of their alliance. Yi Mok noticed their silent appeal. Inside his mind, he pondered their request for help and questioned what decision he should make. At that moment, Namgung secretly sent a telepathic message to him. In the message, Namgung apologized and warned that if he were taken by the demonic cult, the information about their organization and the secrets hidden within their faction would inevitably fall into enemy hands. He stressed that such a development would place not only the alliance, but the entire Orthodox Murim in grave danger. Yi Mok fell into thought. Within his mind, he acknowledged that Namgung's reasoning was correct. The demonic cult had already grown extremely powerful, battle, and if they gained even more strength, the fragile balance among the three great forces could collapse entirely. After reaching his decision, Yi-Mok addressed Chun Yo-won and asked if it would be possible for him to withdraw from this matter. Yo-won reacted with a short question, expressing disbelief at the request. Yi-Mok continued by explaining his reasoning. He admitted that Yo-won's subordinate had indeed injured the Namgung Patriarch, but emphasized that the final capture had been carried out by Moyong Kong and Hong Palwu. Because of that, he argued that fairness dictated that the captives should remain with the alliance. Before Yi-Mok could finish speaking, Yo-won released a quiet sigh. In the next instant, Yo-won extended his hand toward Namgung and a powerful surge of energy burst forth. Namgung, who had been standing behind the leaders, suddenly felt his body lift helplessly into the air. Shock overtook him as his body rose and was violently pulled through the air toward Chun Yo-won. Yi-Mok immediately grabbed hold of Namgung as the force pulled him forward and attempted to drag him back. Chun Yo-won paid no attention to the protest and continued pulling him with overwhelming force. Namgung found himself trapped between the opposing powers of two of the greatest leaders of Yulin. Yi-Mok strained to hold him in place, but the difference in raw strength between the two was simply too vast. Yi-Mok's grip could not endure for long. Suddenly, the fabric of Namgung's clothing tore apart. With another tearing sound cutting through the air, Namgung's body was abruptly dragged free. He was pulled through the air and ended up firmly within Chun Yo-won's grasp. Yo-won's hand closed around Namgung's head. Namgung's face turned pale as fear spread across his expression. Voices of shock rose from the leaders of the Murim Alliance as they called out to Namgung. Chun Yo-won turned his gaze toward Yi-Mok and the leaders of the Murim Alliance, a cynical smile forming on his face. He remarked that they themselves had claimed a captive belonged to whoever captured him, and therefore the man's life now rested in his hands. Yi-Mok and the Alliance leaders were left speechless. Yo-won calmly declared that he would now take the man. Namgung desperately shouted toward the Alliance head, pleading for him not to simply stand there and watch. Before he could continue, Yo-won pressed the blood points on his throat. Namgung's voice was instantly silenced, leaving him unable to speak. Yo-won observed that even after blocking the man's voice, he remained irritatingly noisy. At that moment, Poon Chung-won stepped forward and respectfully requested that Yo-won hand the Namgung Patriarch over to the Alliance. He emphasized that Namgung was still one of their key members. Yo-won responded by posing a blunt question. He asked Elder Pung whether he would allow an enemy to walk free after that enemy had attempted to kill him. Poon Chung-won fell silent, unable to produce any answer. Yo-won then stated that he would speak plainly without hiding his meaning behind words like respect or alliance. He directly questioned whether they wished to protect Namgung simply because he was their ally, or if there was another reason behind their insistence. As he spoke, Yo-won extended his hand. One of the corpses scattered within Jin Castle suddenly flew toward him. The body belonged to a member of the organization whose head had been severed. These were the individuals who had lost their pain and emotions, beings who would not die unless their heads were cut off. Yo-won then confronted the Alliance leaders with the true reason. He declared that they feared the demonic cult would uncover the technique of the Blue Heaven Society. He added that if they truly wished to protect the Namgung Patriarch, they should have restrained him before the war had even begun. Yi-Mok finally spoke with frank honesty. He admitted that the technique displayed during the battle was far too dangerous. He explained that the Orthodox Murim feared the possibility of such a technique being misused if it fell into the hands of the demonic cult. The other leaders observed the situation carefully and understood Yi-Mok's intention. By acknowledging the issue first, the Alliance head had established a clear justification for refusing Yo-won's demand. If they seized the initiative in this way, it would deprive Yo-won of a reason to take the Namgung Patriarch. Jagal Yongun recognized the strategy and expressed his agreement. He stated that they shared the same concern about the potential misuse of such a dangerous technique. Within his reasoning, if Chun Yo-won truly had no intention of exploiting it, then Namgung could simply be punished under the laws of the Orthodox Murim, and placing him in captivity would be sufficient. Yi-Mok reflected within his mind that the response had been exactly what he expected from the Jagal Patriarch. In his thoughts, he believed the demonic cult leader had now lost any justification to take the Namgung Patriarch away. At heart, he was certain Yo-won would be forced to yield, as there was no way the man could openly admit malicious intent before all the heroes present. Within his reasoning, if If Yowon surrendered the Namgung Patriarch, the Orthodox Murim would gain access to the dangerous technique. If Yowon still insisted on taking him, they could further pressure him by accusing him of harboring ill intentions. Chun Yowon then acknowledged that their words carried some sense. Those standing nearby, including the Six Swords, were visibly shocked by his response. The situation gave the impression that Yowon was truly prepared to hand the man over to the Orthodox Morim. Jigal Yong-un, convinced that Yowon had accepted their reasoning, spoke again and praised him as a hero worthy of the lands, expressing confidence that he held no malicious intentions. He then turned to the members of the Orthodox Murim and instructed the Purple Jade Master to come forward and retrieve the Namgung Patriarch. At that moment, Yowon suddenly stopped them. Jigal Yong-un, growing anxious, cautiously asked what the problem was. Yowon calmly explained that there were still two individuals who remained at large, the executive of the Blue Heaven Society and the leader of the society himself. He warned that if the Orthodox Murim failed to capture them, or allowed them to remain free and threatened the demonic cult again, he would interpret that outcome as the Alliance's true intentions. He further stated that if such a situation occurred, the consequences of their falling out would be left to their imagination. The members of the Orthodox Murim fell into uneasy contemplation. Within their thoughts, they questioned whether Yowon was issuing a threat. At heart, they tried to convince themselves that he likely meant nothing too severe and hoped the matter could simply end there. Jigal Yong-un cleared his throat and assured him that such a situation would never happen. Satisfied with the response, Yowon stated that they could now take the man. Upon hearing this, Jigal Yong-un ordered one of his subordinates to bring the Namgung Patriarch over. The subordinate approached and moved closer to lift Namgung, whose body was covered in blood. In that very instant, a bullet-like stream of chi shot through Namgung's head. A sharp cry escaped as the fatal blow struck. His body trembled violently for a brief moment before collapsing lifelessly onto the ground. Everyone stared in stunned silence at the corpse of Namgung. Jigal Yong-un broke the silence with an outraged shout, demanding to know the meaning behind this act and reminding Yowon that he had agreed to hand the man over. Chun Yowon answered with a faint smile, calmly stating that he had never specified the man would be alive. The Six Swords, who had witnessed the exchange, reacted with quiet amusement. At heart, they found the outcome entirely expected, knowing well that the lord they served would never surrender something that belonged to him so politely. Yi Mok erupted in fury and demanded to know if Chun Yowon intended to insult the Alliance, declaring that this was no time for mockery. Yowon responded calmly, stating that he had only followed their request. He explained that they themselves had insisted it was his right, and since they had refused to allow him to take the man as a hostage, killing him remained the standard method of taking revenge. Jigal Yong-un tightened his grip on the hilt of his sword and attempted to respond, struggling to clarify that his earlier words had not meant such a thing. At that moment, a powerful surge of energy rose abruptly, causing the surrounding people to stiffen. Markham appeared. With a cold voice, Markham addressed the Jigal Patriarch and questioned who he believed himself to be standing before. Jigal Yong-un stammered in shock as he recognized the Dark King. A deep sense of danger overwhelmed him. Within his mind, the pressure felt as though a blade had been pressed against his neck. Markim's voice carried the chill of death as he questioned whether Jigal Yong-un was admitting to lying in front of their leader. He declared that if that were the case, he would show no mercy. The killing intent surrounding Markham made it seem as if he could strike at any moment. Jigal Yong-un desperately tried to think of a solution. Suddenly, energy rippled through the air. Before he could even realize when it had happened, members of the demonic cult had already gathered around him. Alarmed, Jigal Yong-un sent a telepathic message to Yi Mok, anxiously admitting that the situation had turned against them and asking what they should do. Yi Mok remained silent, unable to give any response. Chun Yowon then spoke again, calmly reasoning that if the Namgung Patriarch had truly been an enemy they wished to execute, receiving him as a corpse should have been acceptable. In that way, he added, there would be no risk of the Orthodox Murim Alliance misusing the technique. Yi Mok slowly shook his head. Within his mind, a realization surfaced as he questioned whether Yowon had ever been after the method of the Blue Heaven Society in the first place. Meanwhile, Yowon reflected privately that he had no need for it. The Divine Physician, the creator of that very technique, already resided within the demonic cult. Jigal Yong-un felt frustration surge through him as he recognized how badly the situation had unfolded. In his thoughts, he cursed his own actions, realizing that his attempt to deceive Yowon had only backfired backfired. Because of this, the Alliance would now be forced to eliminate the remnants of the Blue Heaven Society themselves. Within his mind, the grim conclusion formed that the Orthodox sects, and perhaps the entire Jonghu, had already fallen into the grasp of that man. Peng Chungwon also reflected quietly that the demonic cult leader's true target must have been the Blue Heaven Society from the beginning. Within his thoughts, he realized that he had even ended up providing Yowon with a justification to invade the Orthodox Murim Alliance. Yimok contemplated the situation deeply. Inside his mind, he finally acknowledged the truth. The demonic cult they now faced was completely different from the one they had known before. There was nothing more they could do. Unlike the Alliance, the demonic cult had preserved most of its forces, while the Orthodox side had lost countless men, including the White Ring Squad. Even if that had not been the case, he realized that the existence of Chun Yo-won alone changed everything. At heart, Yimok understood that the man before him was no mere cult leader, but a being like a demon god. He had believed that the balance of the Jonghu would shift after the events of this day, and it had indeed changed, entirely in favor of the demonic cult leader. At last, Yimok spoke. He stated that he had never intended to misuse the physique operation technique. Since Yowon had declared that his issue with the Namgung Patriarch was resolved, he announced that the Alliance would no longer reproach him over the matter. Jagal Yong-un felt bitterness rise within him as he realized that the Alliance was being forced to back down. Yimok, however, carried a heavy sense of regret. Deep within his heart, he felt sorrow for the many heroes present, yet he knew there was no other choice. Within his mind, he acknowledged that provoking any further conflict might lead to consequences they could not possibly withstand. Jagal Yong-un understood the intention behind Yimok's actions. Within his mind, he recognized the strategy, recalling the hardships endured by King Gujian, and realizing that enduring a humiliation of pride like this was not truly a serious matter in comparison. Yimok then brought his fist to his palm and formally addressed Chun Yo-won. He offered an apology if Yo-won had been displeased by what had happened, and respectfully requested that the members of the demonic cult withdraw so that the leaders could calmly discuss what should occur next. Chun Yo-won looked at Yimok for a moment before raising his hand. Immediately, the warriors of the demonic cult who had surrounded them vanished from their positions, retreating as swiftly as if they had never been there. A wave of relief swept through the leaders of the factions and the Murim Alliance, and heavy sighs escaped them as the tension eased. Yowon assessed the situation privately. Within his thoughts, he concluded that they had already pushed the Orthodox Murim far enough, and that it was appropriate to stop there. Although they had emerged victorious from the war, they had not completely eradicated the berserk saber of the Six Martial Arts sect. The unorthodox alliance had also suffered minimal losses, so there was no reason to break the existing alliance. At heart, he regarded the alliance as something that was still useful. Meanwhile, in the Dragon Palace of the Empire, a completely different tension filled the throne room. The Emperor sat solemnly upon the throne. Below him, seated on a lower position, was the first prince, the Sage King Ju Tae-hyun, who had been granted the title of Crown Prince beginning with the NANO festival. Though the matter had not been openly announced outside the palace, the Sage King had become the central figure in the shrine incident and had ultimately taken the position of Crown Prince. Within his heart, he felt a quiet sense of triumph. Yet the heavy atmosphere within the throne room prevented any expression of joy. All attention was focused on a single matter. At the center of the hall knelt two figures on one knee, Yongjo, the northern commander, and a eunuch from the West Spear. Placed before them lay a round iron explosive. The Emperor erupted in fury, demanding to know how an organization from the Jonghu could possibly possess explosives that were meant to be monopolized by the imperial authority. His anger intensified as he declared that such weapons had been planted throughout the underground of the fortress. He denounced the plot as a grave attempt to detonate the explosives in a place where the Crown Prince and numerous civil officials had been present. In his rage, he declared them enemies of the Empire and refused to remain idle in the face of such a threat. He immediately ordered the commander of the embroidered uniform guards to mobilize his forces and launch a raid against the berserk saber of the Six Martial Arts sect. Following the imperial command, Baek Jagi, the commander of the embroidered uniform guards, departed for Tonggi County alongside the southern military general Yon Namgun and a force of 10,000 soldiers. The order effectively marked the beginning of a war against a powerful faction of the Jonghu. However, only a few hours after the army had been deployed, a report arrived stating that Supreme Commander Baekjagi had already begun returning. The emperor waited impatiently to hear what had transpired. At that moment, the eunuchs stationed outside the throne room raised their voices to announce that Supreme Commander Baekjagi had arrived and was requesting permission to enter. The emperor immediately ordered that he be allowed inside. Baekjagi hurried into the hall and respectfully knelt, formally greeting the emperor as the Supreme Commander. The emperor demanded to know why the army had withdrawn only hours after being dispatched. Baekjagi offered an apology and explained that before their forces had even reached the fortress, every enemy within it had already been killed. The emperor reacted with astonishment and questioned whether cult leader had been responsible. Although the empire had lent him the armor and equipment of the embroidered uniform guards, the emperor remarked that accomplishing such a task so quickly seemed unbelievable. Baekjagi continued his report, explaining that in their effort to reach the fortress quickly, the southern military general and several members of the embroidered uniform guards had been sent ahead to assess the situation. During the chaos that followed, the southern military general and the envoy had fled, leaving behind a few of the embroidered uniform guards. The commander had gathered information from those remaining soldiers and relayed their account. As Baekjagi recounted what they had heard, disbelief spread through the throne room. The emperor and the civil servants struggled to accept the report, questioning whether such a thing was truly possible. They wondered if the demonic cult leader had truly killed all those people by himself. The eunuchs of the Western Depot were equally stunned, unable to believe what they were hearing. The emperor, overwhelmed by the account, repeated the report in shock, describing how the man had soared into the sky and struck the fortress with lightning. Seotesik voiced his confusion, questioning how a human could possibly achieve such a feat. Meanwhile, the Sage King reacted very differently. Within his mind, he felt admiration, considering the display incredible, and quietly affirming that forming an alliance with that man had been the right decision. Baekjagi concluded his explanation by stating that this was the reason their forces had withdrawn. Once the report ended, an oppressive silence filled the entire throne room. Baekjagi contemplated the emperor's reaction. Within his thoughts, he believed the emperor must have been deeply shocked. A being who had surpassed human limits would naturally pose a frightening threat to someone who ruled the empire, and he suspected that the emperor might now fear that figure even more than before. As the officials remained troubled and silent, the emperor slowly opened his mouth. He declared with quiet firmness that the national religion would never change for as long as he lived. The statement left everyone stunned. It was a truth that none present could challenge. A full month passed after the day of the NANO festival, and news spread across the Jianghu with astonishing speed. It did not take long for the events that had occurred at Jin Castle to become widely known. The Orthodox Murim Alliance publicly announced that they had cooperated with the demonic cult to eliminate the schemes of the Berserk Saber of the Six Martial Arts sect and the Unorthodox Alliance. Through this statement, they attempted to avoid humiliation. However, the explanation carried little meaning. Far too many people had personally witnessed what had truly happened. Meanwhile, within a fortress hidden among the 10,000 mountains, a middle-aged man with short hair rested on a bed while drinking a warm beverage. The man was Chun Yuzhong, the former lord. After remaining in a coma for several months, he had finally regained consciousness. Submeng, the right guardian, laughed heartily and remarked that the drink was still hot, advising him to take his time. Submeng had visited the former lord the previous day and had been recounting everything that had taken place during his long unconscious state. Yuzhong asked him to continue the story, noting that he had stopped earlier after mentioning that Yowon, correcting himself to refer to him properly as cult leader Chun, was currently residing in Kaifeng. Submeng confirmed the matter and explained that the demon lord was presently occupied with affairs related to the cult's branch in Kaifeng. Yuzhong reacted with disbelief as the realization settled within his mind. The entire city of Kaifeng had effectively become territory of the cult. He found it difficult to accept and questioned how the Orthodox Murim Alliance could have allowed such a development. Submeng responded with amusement, remarking that the alliance had truly been left with no choice at all. The situation had unfolded after the Great Ming Empire openly supported the Heavenly Demon Divine cult. The empire changed its national religion and issued an imperial decree ordering the construction of a branch of the Heavenly Demon Divine cult in the capital, Kaifeng. The Murim Alliance formally announced that they would accept this decision out of respect for the emperor and the imperial authority. In reality, however, they had lost nearly 30% of their forces, including many high-ranking figures who had been connected to the Blue Heaven Society. In such a weakened weakened state, breaking their alliance would have surrounded them with enemies on every side, leaving them with no realistic option but to accept the situation. Submeng grinned as he explained that everything had happened because the cult leader had demonstrated overwhelming martial prowess during the battle. Yuzhong quietly reflected on everything he had heard. Only 3 days had passed since he awakened, yet the changes around him still felt difficult to grasp. His memories remained fragmented following his battle with the leader of the Berserk Saber of the Six Martial Arts sect. Realizing that so many events had unfolded while he remained unconscious filled him with astonishment. At the same time, he found it strange that everyone had begun calling him the Supreme Heavenly Demon. Yet what surprised him most was the fact that the child he once knew had risen all the way to the life and death realm. Chun Yuzhong remarked that it seemed he would now have to pass on his title as one of the 5 great martial artists to the cult leader. Submeng cleared his throat and apologized respectfully, explaining that the Demon Lord had already been given that title after the war. Yuzhong reacted with shock, struggling to believe the statement as he questioned whether it was truly real. A quiet sense of disappointment stirred within him. Deep within his heart, he reflected on the past and lamented that he had never even been able to give the boy a warm embrace when he was younger, let alone teach him his martial techniques. Yet despite that absence, the child had reached such an extraordinary realm entirely through his own efforts at such a young age. Within his heart, pride swelled as he thought of Yunhua and silently expressed how proud he was of their child. Submeng, who had once served as the teacher of the current lord, found it impossible to hide his joy. Pride filled him as he spoke, and he was equally pleased to see Yuzhong feeling uplifted by the news. Yuzhong observed Submeng's unusually cheerful expression and questioned the reason behind such happiness. He reasoned that if the cult leader had truly become one of the 5 strongest warriors, then he must have earned a title worthy of such status. Submeng responded with a grin and declared that the cult leader had received the greatest title that could exist within the cult. Yuzhong was taken aback by the statement. Submeng then revealed the title with unmistakable pride, explaining that he was now called the Demon God. The words caused Chun Yuzhong to tremble. His reaction did not stem from the grandeur of the name itself, but from the deeper meaning behind it. Since the era of Chun Ma, no one had been granted the title of Demon God. Now, after generations of leaders, it had been bestowed once again. Gasping breaths echoed through an ice cave where the air was so cold that misty vapor flowed from the entrance with every exhale. Blood dripped steadily onto the frozen ground. Nearly an hour earlier, a boy had been running through the cave in desperate haste. The thick fur coat he wore had been soaked completely red with blood. His breathing came out in ragged bursts as pain spread through the wounds across his body. With every step he took, the cuts along his body throbbed more violently. While running, his foot suddenly caught on jagged shards of ice scattered across the ground. The boy lost his balance and crashed heavily onto the frozen floor. The impact worsened his already severe injuries, and blood gushed out, staining the ice a deep crimson. Agony surged through him as he struggled to endure the pain. In his mind, he realized that if he did not escape the cave quickly to treat the wounds, the freezing cold could cause the flesh to necrotize. Yet even more urgently, he knew he had to report the situation to the palace. At that moment, something strange occurred. A deep rumble spread through the cave. The entire cavern trembled violently as if struck by an earthquake. Thick ice cracked apart and misty vapor filled the boy's vision. A wave of dread struck his heart. He realized with terror that the creature he believed he had escaped might be attempting to break through the thick ice sealing the cave. Fear gripped him as he scrambled to escape. Suddenly, explosive impacts thundered through the cavern. A monstrous roar followed. The solid ice wall shattered apart and a black monster burst through with a furious howl. The sight left the boy frozen in shock as the impossible realization formed in his mind. The creature had broken through the massive wall of ice. Instinctively, he covered his mouth, desperately trying to breathe without making a sound. At that very moment, the monster noticed him. Its glowing yellow eyes narrowed sharply like a serpent's, revealing rows of vicious fangs. With a savage cry, the creature lunged. The boy screamed as terror overwhelmed him while he struggled desperately to escape. The boy suddenly awoke. Cold sweat covered his face as he realized it had been a nightmare. Within his mind, dread lingered as the same thought surfaced once more, that the event would happen again. His face, marked with numerous scars, glistened with sweat as he wiped it away with the back of his hand. When he turned his head, he saw a middle-aged man sitting nearby. The man wore a fur coat and calmly fed dry branches into a bonfire. The man observed him and asked if the same dream had returned again. The boy addressed him respectfully as uncle. The man remarked that the memory must have been deeply engraved in his mind. He reasoned that such a thing was natural, considering that the boy was the only person who had ever survived that monster. The boy remained silent, continuing to wipe the sweat from his face. The man removed his fur coat and remarked with a weary breath that it had been a long time since he had last come to Zhongyuan. Within his thoughts, the climate felt unbearably hot compared to where he came from, and he could not understand how people managed to live comfortably in such weather. He noted that they had been traveling for 3 days without sleep and suggested that the boy should rest a little longer. However, the boy firmly refused the suggestion. In his mind, the thought of resting felt impossible while the monster remained trapped within the ice, uncertain when it might break free again. The man reminded him that he had barely slept during the 2 weeks it had taken them to reach this place. He then explained that they would soon part ways. His own destination was the headquarters of the Orthodox Murim Alliance. He then asked whether the boy truly intended to continue on to Kaifeng. The boy gave a silent nod in response. The man released a quiet sigh and remarked that the boy was just as stubborn as his father. He questioned whether the boy truly believed anyone would help him, noting that in the Jianghu of Zhongyuan, only the Orthodox martial artists valued cooperation. The boy responded firmly, believing that attempting something was better than never trying at all. The man dismissed the idea, warning that demonic martial artists would never offer help. In his view, the boy did not understand how cruel and evil those people truly were. The boy remained silent, hiding his true thoughts. Within his mind, he acknowledged that he could not even reveal the object he carried to his own uncle, who sat right beside him, because he could not trust him. Deep within, he believed that the demonic cult might assist him if he possessed that object. A masked man had once given him a jade plaque and instructed him to deliver it safely. The boy trusted that if the masked man's words were true, then the demonic cult might be willing to help him. Far away in Kaifeng, near the newly established branch of the demonic cult, several people sat under a canopy set up to block the harsh sunlight. They calmly ate bowls of duck meat noodles while sipping light drinks. The street nearby was busy with people passing by, yet no one approached the canopy. The reason was obvious. Those seated beneath it all wore red robes marked with the single character, Demon. Anyone could instantly recognize them as members of the demonic cult. Although a month had passed since the opening of the new branch in Kaifeng, the townspeople still avoided them. Their fear remained rooted in the long-standing prejudice against the demonic cult. Hobum looked around in frustration and wondered aloud why no one came to eat there, unable to understand why everyone avoided them. The waitress serving the area felt deep irritation at his words. Within her thoughts, she questioned how he could fail to understand such an obvious reason and privately wished they would simply move upstairs to the second floor to eat. Wang Hul responded calmly, reasoning that it would take time for things to change. He pointed out that the situation was already better than when they had first arrived. Hobum reluctantly agreed, but expressed frustration, feeling that they still had a very long road ahead. Samachuk laughed loudly at his impatience. Within his reasoning, it was impossible to completely change attitudes that the Orthodox factions had cultivated over centuries in merely a single month. He reminded them that thanks to the fame of the Demon Lord, 100 new recruits had already joined the cult. To him, that alone was meaningful progress. Hobum remained dissatisfied, pointing out that all of those recruits were still people from the Jianghu. Wang Hul responded that this was still a positive development. Within his thoughts, it meant that many people desired to serve under the Demon Lord, the youngest martial artist ever to become one of the 5 great martial artists. Hobum admitted that even this fact bothered him somewhat. At heart, he believed the Demon Lord should already be considered the greatest martial artist alive. After all, even the head of the Murim Alliance had been unable to match him, and he alone had faced 3 martial artists of the mystic realm at the same time. Wang Hul acknowledged that the argument carried truth. Sanghua then suggested another possible reason for the hesitation surrounding Yowun's recognition. She mentioned the existence of the Monster of the East. Hobum reacted with confusion at the unfamiliar title. Samachuk immediately understood and clarified that she was referring to the battle god of the East. The man known as Ak Yui carried that title. With nothing but his fists, he had reached the pinnacle of martial arts and earned a title containing the word God long before Chun Yowun had ever risen to power. Hobum dismissed the matter with a shake of his head, insisting that such stories were nothing more than rumors. In his view, the Demon Lord could not even be compared with that figure, since Chun Yo-won had already demonstrated his martial prowess before thousands of witnesses. At those words, Wang Hul, who had been quietly smiling, snorted and pointed out that Hobum was simply brushing aside what Sanghwa had said. The remark instantly flustered Ho Sanghwa. Her face flushed red, and the noodles she had been eating spilled from her mouth. Hobum immediately seized the moment and teased Wang Hul, loudly pointing out the way he had referred to her as my Sanghwa. With exaggerated disbelief, he remarked that the two were being far too obvious about their relationship. The sudden outburst caused Sama Chuk, who was seated across from Sanghwa, to end up with noodles splattered across his face. Hobum continued his rambling complaints without pause. He mockingly apologized for being single and remarked that he had been holding back from saying something earlier. According to him, the small and fragile chair they were sharing looked as if it might break from how closely the two sat together. His relentless stream of commentary caused Sanghwa to glance at Wang Hul beside her. She had previously told him not to call her my Sanghwa in front of others, yet now that he had done it again, she realized they would likely have to endure Hobum's complaints throughout the entire meal. Amid the noisy chatter, Hobum suddenly stopped speaking. Confusion crossed his face as he stared in a particular direction. The others followed his gaze. A boy wearing a long robe and bearing numerous scars across his face was approaching them. At first glance, they recognized that the scarred boy possessed martial training. Judging from his presence, his strength appeared to be around the early peak levels. Without hesitation, the boy dropped to his knees. He introduced himself respectfully and greeted them as members of the Sky Demon Order. The sudden gesture left everyone confused. The boy then spoke with earnest determination, asking to be allowed to see the lord of the demonic cult. His request left the group momentarily speechless. Given his ragged appearance, they assumed he was merely a wandering martial artist hoping to enroll in the academy. Hobum stood up and explained that if the boy wished to enter the academy, he should head to the alley across the street and make inquiries at the branch office there. However, the scarred boy quickly shook his head. He apologized and clarified that he had not come for that purpose. His reason for coming was to meet the lord of the demonic cult and ask for his help. Hobum frowned at the request. He questioned whether the boy truly believed they would simply agree and take him to the cult leader just because he had suddenly asked to see him. Before Hobum could finish speaking, the scarred youth reached into his sleeve and pulled something out. It was a jade plaque. The moment Hobum saw it, recognition flashed across his face. Wang Hul leaned closer to see what had caught his attention. The instant he saw the object, his eyes widened in shock. Inside the training hall of the branch, nearly 400 warriors of the demonic cult stood in their training uniforms, watching an intense duel unfold. At the center of the hall were two of the 6 swords, Baek-ji and Chae-takim. Unlike traditional martial battles, neither of them carried weapons. Their combat relied entirely on close-quarters techniques that differed greatly from conventional martial arts. Instead of forming chi through the usual circulation of internal energy, their movements were designed to strike directly at an opponent's blood points. Baek-ji avoided an incoming strike by spinning through the air with his distinctive footwork. While still mid-motion, he attempted to launch a powerful kick toward Chae-takim. Before the attack could land, Chae-takim seized Baek-ji's leg with his bare hands. The spectators reacted with astonished exclamations. The clash did not end there. The moment Chae-takim caught the leg, he twisted his body with the coiling motion of a snake constricting its prey. His limbs wrapped tightly around Baek-ji, restraining him with enough pressure to threaten the joints of his leg. The watching cult warriors could not hide their amazement as the exchange unfolded at a blinding pace. Within the struggle, Chae-takim grinned and urged Baek-ji to surrender, warning that continuing to resist might leave him crippled. Baek-ji clenched his teeth in anger and frustration. Inside his mind, he realized that if the hold continued any longer, his knee would be destroyed. Determined to break free, Baek-ji bent his body and gathered internal energy into his arms. Then he spread his legs and began rotating them rapidly like the blades of a windmill. The sudden force disrupted Chae-takim's hold. Unable to withstand the powerful motion, Chae-takim was thrown away. Baek-ji rolled across the floor, but as his rotation intensified, the motion began to resemble the spinning force of a typhoon. The sharp wind pressure generated by his energy-filled legs created a powerful barrier, making it difficult for anyone to approach. The cult followers watched in awe as Baekji escaped the restraint, marveling at how such a technique could be executed so effectively. Chae-takim acknowledged the unexpected escape and questioned when Baekji had learned such a method. Nearby, Chun Yo-won silently observed the display. Within his mind, he asked NANO for an evaluation. NANO analyzed the technique and noted that the distribution of energy in the capoeira windmill had been perfectly balanced. According to the analysis, the damage inflicted would double if enhanced energy were applied to it. In the past, NANO had introduced Yo-won to several martial arts from the future: boxing, taekwondo, jiu-jitsu, and capoeira. Yo-won had studied those forms and merged them with internal energy, transforming them into his own martial arts. Because the traditional techniques of Zhongyuan could often be countered once their movements were understood, Yo-won ensured that every motion in these adapted styles targeted vital points and critical weaknesses of the opponent. And through that process, the future martial arts had been reborn into entirely new and dangerous combat techniques. Chun Yo-won observed the fight with satisfaction. Within his mind, he reflected that he had initially been concerned the warriors might struggle to learn the new techniques, but that worry had proven unnecessary. Although differences in talent naturally existed among individuals, Baekji and Chae-takim had mastered the skills exceptionally well. Chae-takim had adapted more naturally to boxing and jiu-jitsu, relying heavily on hand-based combat, while Baekji had gravitated toward taekwondo and capoeira, which suited his mastery of kicking techniques. Each of them had embraced the styles that best matched their strengths. Yo-won had originally taught these techniques to Baekji, Chae-takim, and Ho Jin-chang as a way to test the newly developed martial arts, yet all three had learned them remarkably well within only a few months. Ho Jin-chang stepped forward and ordered the fight to end. The warriors watching the duel erupted in cheers as the confrontation concluded. Jin-chang then instructed everyone to pay close attention. He explained that what they had just witnessed was a martial art created by their lord, a unified system that combined multiple forms of combat. According to him, this new discipline would become the foundational martial art of their academy. Yo-won listened quietly. Although he felt pleased with the results, a faint discomfort remained within him. Strictly speaking, the martial art had been created through NANO's analysis rather than by his own effort alone. Jin-chang then loudly declared that starting from that day forward, he would once again take the role of instructor. His responsibility would be to teach this unified combat art to all of them, and he urged the warriors to master it perfectly so that they would not bring shame upon the demon lord. The assembled warriors responded with a unified shout of acknowledgement. Yo-won contemplated the future developments within the cult. Within his thoughts, he recognized that the next stage had already begun. The process of transforming the blood of the fire Kirin into a stable miracle medicine was underway. He had already handed over NANO's analysis to those responsible, which would accelerate the work. Before long, he believed the cult would grow as powerful as he intended. Meanwhile, outside the Great Hall, two women observed the training from a distance. They were Mun-ku and Yogun. Mun-ku, who usually carried a gentle smile, now stood with faintly reddened cheeks. Her awareness of the woman beside her made her unusually tense. Yogun stood calmly with a pale face resembling Yo-won's and long silver hair that fell gracefully behind her. Her gaze remained fixed entirely on Yo-won, who sat inside the Great Hall. Seeing Yogun's cheeks gradually flush red as she watched him caused irritation to stir within Mun-ku. Her own face began to redden with restrained anger. Within her thoughts, Mun-ku reflected that 5 days had passed since Yogun had arrived with the Left Guardian. Although the Left Guardian had already returned to the cult's main base, Yogun remained behind and constantly lingered somewhere near the demon lord. Mun-ku reminded herself of the promise she had made to be more open and bold, recalling that she herself had once agreed to allow this woman someplace beside him. Clearing her throat, Mun-ku addressed Yogun and gently suggested that since she had not fully recovered yet, she should return and rest. Yogun responded with a soft smile. She explained that she felt perfectly fine and found it pleasant to enjoy the fresh air while watching the demon lord. She even suggested that if Mun-ku felt tired, she could go back inside without worrying about her. The response struck Mun-ku like a direct blow. Her cheeks flushed deeper with embarrassment and frustration. Within her thoughts, Yogun quietly apologized to Mun-ku. She reasoned privately that opportunities to see the demon lord were rare, and she intended to use this chance. In her heart, she promised that if matters progressed smoothly between herself and the demon lord, she would treat Mun-ku well, at least until that time arrived. As the two silently competed with each other, someone suddenly rushed into the Great Hall. It was Hobam. Munku frowned the moment she saw him, but Hobam appeared far too urgent to notice her presence. Without offering a greeting, he hurried straight toward Yowon. The sudden intrusion drew attention. Yowon himself looked surprised at Hobam's hurried arrival. Moments later, Yowon reacted with visible shock as Hobam delivered his report. Someone had appeared carrying the jade plaque belonging to his missing grandfather. Hobam held the object in his hand. It was a jade plaque engraved with the signature of the former lord, Chun Inji. Chun Yowon followed Hobam toward the hall where the visitor was waiting. As he walked, Yowon quietly asked Nano about the results of the analysis. Nano reported that the object was made of the same material as the sample already in Yowon's possession is jade. Yowon reflected within his mind that the plaque belonged to his grandfather, who had disappeared 20 years earlier. After the disappearance, every member of the cult across Zhongyuan had been tasked with searching for him, yet the effort had ultimately failed. The great guardian Markham cautioned Yowon to prepare for every possible outcome. Although the plaque itself was genuine, the situation surrounding its appearance felt suspicious. Yowon responded calmly that the truth would become clear once they met the person who had brought it. Markham contemplated the matter privately. He had been the last person to meet the supreme heavenly demon before his disappearance, yet the man had never explained his reason for leaving. Remembering the careful and calculating nature of the supreme heavenly demon, Markham found it difficult to believe that such a person would casually hand his own identity plaque to someone else to deliver. When they entered the guest room on the eastern side of the building, Wang Hul and Sanghua were already waiting inside with the boy. The two cult members immediately stood and respectfully greeted their lord. The boy's eyes fixed directly on Chun Yowon. Inside his mind, the boy struggled to reconcile what he saw. The man before him appeared completely ordinary, giving off no visible trace of martial arts at all. At first glance, he seemed no different from the refined son of a prestigious family. Doubt crept into his thoughts, wondering if the people before him were attempting to deceive or test him. However, the masked man standing beside Yowon radiated an immense and oppressive aura. Within his mind, the boy realized that the figure could only be the Dark King. With that realization, he concluded that the man standing before him truly must be the demonic cult leader. Yowon calmly asked whether the boy was the one who had brought the plaque. The boy immediately confirmed that he was. Wang Hul then scolded him sharply. Earlier, the boy had insisted that he would reveal nothing until he met the demon lord. Now that the lord stood before him, Wang Hul questioned why he remained silent without even introducing himself. Startled, the boy quickly knelt on the ground. With deep respect, he introduced himself as Danbaek Hyun, explaining that he had come as a representative of the Northern Sea Ice Palace. The declaration surprised Yowon. The Northern Sea Ice Palace existed beyond the boundaries of Zhongyuan. Outside the walls of Zhongyuan, powerful forces had formed their own version of the Jianghu. On Changbai Mountain in the east stood the Changbai sect, widely regarded as the origin of swordsmanship. The Potala Palace, much like the Shaolin Temple, was renowned for its mastery of internal energy cultivation techniques. Another powerful group was Gelug, which had risen in Tibet. Finally, in the far northern region near Lake Baikal lay the Northern Sea Ice Palace, a land of perpetual snow where practitioners cultivated yin-based martial arts. Markham considered the situation carefully. 30 years earlier, the Northern Sea Ice Palace had descended with the intention of conquering the Jianghu, but they had abandoned the campaign within less than a month and established peace with the Orthodox Murim alliance. Within his thoughts, he questioned why someone from that place had now appeared here. Meanwhile, Yowon quietly examined the boy. Although the youth claimed to be a representative of the Northern Sea Ice Palace, his appearance told a different story. His face was covered with scars, and his clothes were worn and ragged, making him look more like a wandering beggar than an envoy from a powerful faction. Markham questioned the boy calmly, asking whether he possessed any proof to support his claim of being a representative of the Northern Sea Ice Palace. Danbaek hesitated before admitting the truth. He explained nervously that he was not actually the official representative. That role belonged to his uncle. Sanghua immediately repeated the word in confusion, prompting Danbaek to struggle with how to explain the situation. With everyone watching him suspiciously, he appeared visibly flustered. Trying to regain control of the situation, Danbake insisted that he could still prove his connection to the Northern Sea Ice Palace. He requested that the restrictions placed on his internal energy be lifted for a moment so he could demonstrate. Wang Hul reacted with raised eyebrows at the request, but once Yowon allowed it, the restraint on Danbake's internal energy was removed. The moment the restriction disappeared, a cold mist flowed from Danbake's mouth as he inhaled deeply. He then pointed toward a teacup sitting on the table. Cold energy gathered in his hand. Instantly, the half-filled teacup froze solid, and faint vapor rose above it. Within his mind, Danbake regretted his earlier hesitation. He realized that he could have demonstrated the ice-white divine palm, the signature martial art of the Northern Sea Ice Palace, earlier. Instead, panic had caused him to act awkwardly and only deepened their suspicion. However, the reaction he received was not what he expected. The eyes staring back at him remained filled with doubt. Some of them even looked irritated. Although he had displayed the ice palm of the Northern Sea Ice Palace, the atmosphere in the room did not soften at all. Confused by their reaction, Danbake watched as Yowon calmly placed his hand on the table. In the next moment, an overwhelming surge of cold energy spread outward, chilling the entire room. White frost rapidly formed across the surface of the table until it froze completely. Yowon then lightly struck the frozen table. Cracks spread across the surface instantly, as if the entire structure were on the verge of shattering. Danbake stood frozen in shock. Inside his mind, disbelief exploded as he tried to comprehend what he had just witnessed. The table had frozen solid in a single instant, and the intensity of the yin energy far exceeded the application speed of the ice-white divine arts. He could not understand how someone outside the Northern Sea Ice Palace could possess such extreme yin internal energy. Yowon then asked calmly whether that meant he himself should also be considered a member of the Northern Sea Ice Palace. Danbake stammered in confusion, unable to explain how Yowon could wield such overwhelming yin energy. Yowon responded casually, remarking that the matter itself did not seem particularly difficult. At that point, Hobum suggested a simpler approach. He stated that there were far easier ways to extract the truth and implied that he could quickly make the boy confess. Alarmed by the suggestion, Danbake hurriedly tried to explain further. He pointed out that anyone who fully mastered the ice-white divine arts would eventually develop white hair due to the extreme yin internal energy within their body. Yowon observed that Danbake's hair was still dark. Danbake admitted that he had not yet reached the stage where his hair would permanently turn white. However, he explained that if he concentrated his chi to the 10th mastery level, his hair would temporarily change to white. Yowon asked the Great Guardian whether the boy's explanation was true. Markham admitted that he was uncertain. Within his mind, Markham reflected that the head of the Darkness sect might know the answer, but that man was currently at the 10,000 Great Mountains. After thinking briefly, Markham suggested that Junwang might know. 30 years earlier, Junwang had been part of the Orthodox Murim Alliance and would likely be familiar with the Northern Sea Ice Palace. Yowon immediately agreed and ordered Hobum to bring Junwang. Hobum acknowledged the command and left at once. Danbake felt a surge of shock. Within his mind, he realized that the name Yowon had mentioned referred to Wang Zhan, the unrivaled sword. He had heard rumors that this legendary figure had joined the demonic cult, and it now seemed those rumors were true. The realization unsettled him deeply. If 2 of the 5 great martial artists of Zhongyuan were already within the demonic cult, then it would hardly be an exaggeration to say that the cult now possessed immense influence over the entire Jianghu. Yowon then told him to stop being surprised and prove his identity. Understanding that he had no other option, Danbake prepared himself. This time, the cold energy he released differed from before. As the frost gathered around him, visible changes spread through his body. His skin gradually turned pale, and his black hair began changing color from the roots, slowly turning silver. Wang Hul and Sanghua reacted with astonishment as they watched the transformation unfold. Yowon examined the phenomenon with interest. Within his mind, he acknowledged that although he did not know the exact internal energy circulation technique involved, the aura surrounding it carried a mysterious quality. After maintaining the state for a short time, Danbake stopped. The silver hair slowly lost its color and returned to black. Danbake looked at them confidently, asking whether they had seen enough. Inside his mind, he sensed that the atmosphere in the room had clearly shifted compared to earlier. If the unrivaled sword confirmed his identity, he believed he would finally be able to ask the demonic cult leader for help. Above all, he still possessed the identity plaque of the supreme heavenly demon. At that moment, Hobum returned and announced that Junwang had arrived. arrived. Junwang entered the room. Danbake immediately recognized him as Wang Jing, one of the 5 greatest martial artists he had heard about since childhood, and relief filled his heart. However, the moment he turned his head, his expression faltered. Walking beside Junwang was a pale-faced woman with long silver hair. The moment Danbake sensed her presence, shock surged through him. Within his mind, he struggled to comprehend the overwhelming yin energy surrounding her. He wondered whether the woman had also mastered powerful ice arts, capable of turning her hair white. The realization shook him deeply, as he had never imagined encountering someone whose yin internal energy surpassed his own. Overwhelmed by the discovery, he suddenly spoke out in disbelief, questioning how such a thing could be possible without practicing the ice-white divine arts. Hobum looked at him in confusion, remarking that no one had said anything. Meanwhile, at the headquarters of the Orthodox Murim Alliance, another figure waited anxiously inside a separate room. It was Dan Jusong, the uncle of Danbake and a member of the Northern Sea Ice Palace. Dan Jusong remained lost in deep thought. Within his mind, he reflected that the incident in Tongyi County could not have occurred at a worse time. The Orthodox Murim Alliance must have suffered heavy losses as well, and because of that, there was a strong possibility they might refuse to help. Nearly 2 hours had already passed since he had delivered his message to them, and impatience continued to grow inside him. He wished they would provide their answer soon, as time was running short. Meanwhile, inside the chamber of the great leader, Yi Mok sat with 4 other leaders of the Orthodox Murim Alliance. The atmosphere in the room was grave as they carefully studied the contents of a long booklet placed on the table before them. Hong Palwu spoke first, warning that although they had maintained communication with the Northern Sea and even held a peace treaty with the Northern Sea Ice Palace, the situation described in the report was far too dangerous. Mo Young-kang agreed with him and questioned why such a terrifying monster had ever been sealed within the Northern Sea Ice Palace to begin with. The leaders exchanged differing opinions while Yi Mok listened in silence. Hong Palwu continued with urgency, warning them not to underestimate the gravity of the situation. He reminded them that the dragon turtle represented one of the worst calamities humanity had ever known, a disaster that could not be taken lightly. Among the legends of the world were 5 mythical creatures known as the 5 sacred beings: the Great Pang, the Amugi, the Wind-White Tiger, the Fire Kirin, and the Dragon Turtle. The Dragon Turtle was a creature said to possess the head of a dragon and the shell of a turtle. In ancient times, merchants had worshipped the dragon turtle, believing it could bless them with gold and wealth. However, the true nature of the creature was far more terrifying than they had imagined. Mo Young-kang spoke again, recalling the history of his own sect, which had originated from the fallen Yan dynasty. During that era, a 3-headed dragon turtle had appeared and devastated 5 entire provinces. Tens of thousands of civilians had perished in the catastrophe. Even then, the creature had only been defeated through the combined efforts of countless soldiers and martial artists of the Jianghu. Because of that history, the dragon turtle was rightly known as a calamity. Given the current weakened state of the Murim Alliance, he insisted that they could not afford to help the Northern Sea Ice Palace. Monk Guk Yan responded with concern. If they refused the request for assistance, the Northern Sea Ice Palace might be completely destroyed. As allies, abandoning them would raise serious questions about the integrity of the Murim Alliance in the eyes of the entire Jianghu. Mo Young-kang hesitated but still struggled to accept the idea. Yi Mok then spoke, stating that he agreed with the monk. Juk Yang supported the same position. He reminded everyone that the Murim Alliance existed to uphold justice. Ignoring the desperate plea of the Northern Sea Ice Palace would go directly against the principles they claimed to protect. Mo Young-kang fell silent as their arguments weighed on him. Hong Palwu responded with frustration. While he acknowledged that upholding righteousness was the duty of Orthodox martial artists, he pointed out the reality of their situation. The Berserk Saber of the 6 martial arts sect, the demonic cult, and the unorthodox alliance were all growing stronger by the day. If the Murim Alliance suffered further losses, he questioned who would remain capable of protecting Zhongyuan. Juk Yang then proposed a different possibility. If they chose to help, they would have to find a way to do so while minimizing the losses on their own side. Hong Palwu responded sharply, reminding everyone that the Moyang Patriarch had just explained how powerful the dragon turtle was. So powerful that it had once devastated 5 entire provinces. He questioned whether the others truly understood how dangerous such a creature was, and remarked that they should be grateful it had appeared near the Northern Sea, rather than in Zhongyuan. Yi Mok listened to both sides quietly. Within his mind, he acknowledged that each of them was speaking out of concern for the future of the alliance. Yet one detail in the report continued to trouble him. According to the booklet, the dragon turtle's seal had been broken with explosives that had been borrowed followed from Zhongyuan. As Yimok reflected on that point, he noticed that someone else was focusing on the same detail. It was his second son, Kang So. Yimok studied him silently. Within his thoughts, he recognized that the boy seemed to grow more dangerous with time. Nevertheless, Kang So possessed talent comparable to his older brother. In the past, he had even proposed the strategy of eliminating members of both the Unorthodox Alliance and the demonic cult. Yet Yimok also knew that Kang So had displayed an intense thirst for blood ever since 10 years earlier. Among his 3 sons, Kang So was the most ambitious, which was precisely why Yimok had tried to keep him away from the position of successor. 2 weeks had passed since Yan Buso's return, yet the man had still not recovered mentally. Because of that, Yimok had begun allowing Kang So to participate in these meetings, though he remained uncertain about what the outcome of such involvement would ultimately be. Kang So then spoke respectfully, asking the Alliance head and the gathered masters for permission to bring in the envoy from the Northern Sea Ice Palace. He explained that there was something he wished to ask the man, and the answer could determine whether the Alliance would agree to help the Ice Palace or not. Moyong Kong pointed out that they had not yet reached any conclusion on the matter. Kang So replied that the question he intended to ask concerned an important point, one that could decisively influence their final decision. Soon after, Dan Jusong was brought into the room. He entered with an anxious expression, his eyes filled with anticipation as he hoped the Alliance had reached a favorable decision. However, Kang So immediately pointed toward the booklet and began questioning him. He asked whether it was true that the Northern Sea Ice Palace had broken through the ice while searching for an underground passage in hopes of finding the lost treasure of the Northern Sea. According to the report, that meant they had not known the dragon turtle was still alive. Dan Jusong felt a quiet sense of disappointment at the line of questioning, yet he concealed his emotions and answered calmly. He explained that hundreds of years had passed since the dragon turtle had been sealed in ice, and the palace had assumed the creature was long dead. Kang So acknowledged the explanation with a casual remark, stating that the point itself did not matter. The response caused Dan Jusong's eyes to grow colder. He disliked the manner in which Kang So interrogated him, but he remained silent. Kang So continued, pointing out another detail from the booklet. It stated that the disaster had occurred because the excavation used explosives obtained from the Zhonghu. After a brief hesitation, Dan Jusong admitted that this was correct. Kang So remarked that the description remained vague and asked where exactly the explosives had come from. Dan Jusong responded by questioning why such information was relevant. Kang So explained his reasoning. The explosives must have been extremely powerful to destroy the place where the dragon turtle had been sealed. According to the report, those explosives had originated from Zhongyuan. Dan Jusong confirmed the statement. Kang So then pointed out the problem. Explosives of such strength would have to be something like the true heavenly lightning, powerful weapons controlled by the imperial government. Their use outside official purposes was strictly forbidden. Even the Murim Alliance, despite maintaining close relations with the government, could not obtain them. Yimok reflected on the troubling coincidence. Within his mind, he recalled that the berserk saber of the 6 martial arts sect had also planted numerous true heavenly lightnings beneath the ground during the treaty ceremony. That memory continued to disturb him. Dan Jusong, looking perplexed, fell into thought. After a moment, he inhaled deeply and finally spoke. He admitted that he had originally wished to avoid discussing the matter because it involved internal conflicts within the government, but the questioning left him no choice. He revealed that the explosives had not come directly from the government. Instead, they had been supplied by a mysterious organization from Zhongyuan that had approached the Northern Sea Ice Palace themselves. The leaders immediately pressed him for the name of the organization. Dan Jusong admitted that they did not know. The response created confusion, and he explained further. According to what they had been told, the group claimed to be a sect belonging to Zhongyuan's Jianghu. They also said they had connections with elders of the Ice Palace. Because the explosives were banned even within Zhongyuan, the organization had refused to reveal its identity. Kang So's eyes narrowed with suspicion. He questioned whether the elder truly refused to disclose their identity, remarking that such a story was difficult to believe. Dan Jusong answered calmly that the matter could no longer be clarified because the elder was no longer alive. Kang So reacted with surprise. Dan Jusong then revealed the truth. Both the palace master and the elder had died after becoming trapped beneath the collapsing ice stone where the dragon turtle had been sealed. The room fell silent in shock. Because the seal on the booklet had belonged to the deputy leader of the Ice Palace, they had assumed something serious had happened. However, none of them had imagined that both leaders had already died. Yimok expressed regret at the tragic news and offered his condolences for the loss. Dan Jusong acknowledged the sentiment, but clarified that the Palace Master's death had not been an accident. He then took a folded piece of paper from his sleeve and placed it on the table. The paper contained carefully drawn markings. Mo Young Kong, who sat closest, unfolded it and revealed its contents to the others. The moment Yimok saw the blade marks depicted on the sheet, shock spread across his face. Dan Jusong explained that the drawing reproduced the wounds left on the only survivor of the incident. Within his mind, Yimok immediately recognized the patterns of the blade marks. They belonged to the berserk saber of the 6 martial arts sect. During the battle at Jin Castle, they had encountered the same techniques and could recognize them clearly. At the same time in Kaifeng, Chun Yo-won examined the scars on Danbaek's upper body after the boy removed his shirt. The wounds were unmistakable. They were injuries caused by the extreme art of the blade god. Danbaek asked whether Yo-won recognized the martial technique responsible for those wounds. Markham nodded and confirmed that the marks came from the berserk saber divine martial arts of the berserk saber of the 6 martial arts sect. Danbaek felt shock ripple through him. Within his thoughts, he realized that the martial technique that had nearly killed him belonged to the very organization that had only recently emerged. Meanwhile, Yo-won's eyes narrowed. Within his mind, he recognized a disturbing development. The influence of the berserk saber of the 6 martial arts sect had already reached even the distant Northern Sea. Yo-won asked whether it was the 3rd elder who had invited those people. Danbaek confirmed that it was. According to him, the elder had claimed to know a sect in Zhongyuan that specialized in explosives. The reason for contacting them was tied to a sacred relic of the Northern Sea Ice Palace, a divine artifact that had been passed down from one palace master to the next for generations. However, centuries earlier, during the battle against the dragon turtle, the palace master of that era and many warriors had sacrificed their lives. Their bodies had been buried deep within an underground cave sealed beneath the ice stone, along with the relic. Since hundreds of years had passed since that battle, the Ice Palace believed the mythical creature had long since died. With that belief, the current palace master, the 3rd and 4th elders, and the elite warriors of the Northern Sea Ice Palace used the explosives to create an entrance into the sealed cave. At that time, members of the berserk saber of the 6 martial arts sect asked to accompany them because the 3rd elder personally guaranteed their trustworthiness. No one in the Ice Palace questioned it. Together, they entered the cave and discovered the frozen body of the dragon turtle deep within. That was when everything changed. The group from the berserk saber suddenly revealed their true intentions and began attacking the warriors of the Ice Palace. Although the ambush was sudden, the warriors of the Ice Palace, renowned for their martial strength, responded calmly and resisted. However, there was one factor none of them had anticipated. The 3rd elder, whom they had trusted as an ally, betrayed them and stabbed the palace master in the back. After that betrayal, the palace master was immediately attacked by the members of the berserk saber and died on the spot. Danbaek explained that he and the remaining Ice Palace warriors attempted to fight back, but their enemies were far too strong. They could not hold their ground for long. Soon everyone around him had fallen. Barely clinging to life, Danbaek believed everything was over. At that moment, something unexpected occurred. The explosives carried by the berserk saber members suddenly detonated. The blast shattered the ice wall and the frozen dragon turtle was freed. None of them had imagined that a creature sealed in ice for centuries could still be alive. Once released, the dragon turtle went completely berserk. The martial artists of the berserk saber attacked it, but their blades could not even scratch its scales. Instead, they were struck down by the creature's devastating lightning attacks. However, Danbaek noticed that some among them wore steel masks and used a completely different style of martial arts. One of those masked warriors possessed such extraordinary skill that Danbaek believed even the palace master might not have defeated him in a fair duel. Yet even that martial master proved powerless before the dragon turtle. The creature was a true calamity. While the chaos unfolded and everyone was distracted by the monster, Danbaek fled. He ran desperately without ever looking back. During his escape, he heard another tremendous explosion and assumed the masked warriors had used additional explosives in an attempt to kill the dragon turtle. After running for a long time, the sounds of battle finally disappeared. Danbaek believed everyone inside the cave had died, but that belief proved to be a terrible mistake. At one point, the ground suddenly split apart and one of the dragon turtle's massive heads burst through the surface. The sight froze him in terror. In that instant, Danbake realized he had no chance of escaping the creature. As the dragon turtle charged toward him and he prepared to accept his death, something unexpected happened. A man suddenly appeared and struck the dragon turtle directly in its eyes. Yoan immediately asked if the person who saved him was that man. Danbake confirmed it. The one who saved him was a martial artist wearing a steel mask, someone with extraordinary skill. Danbake admitted he had been confused, since he believed that man was part of the Berserk Saber groups. At that moment, the masked man spoke to him. He ordered Danbake to run away and seek help, warning him that the dragon turtle must never fall into their hands. Danbake continued his account, explaining that once he realized the masked man was not his enemy, he suggested that they escape together. However, the man refused. He insisted that someone had to remain behind to ensure the dragon turtle could not leave the cave. Before parting, the masked man handed him the jade plaque and instructed him to find the leader of the heavenly demon divine cult. After giving that order, the masked warrior vanished through the hole the dragon turtle had torn open. Markham immediately understood the implication. Within his mind, he realized who that masked man could be. Danbake added that the masked man had stated he was the rightful owner of the jade plaque. He had also warned that the dragon turtle must never fall into their hands. However, before Danbake could ask who he meant, the man disappeared. Before Danbake could finish speaking, Markham suddenly seized his arms. With intense urgency, Markham demanded to know whether Danbake remembered any of the masked man's martial movements. Danbake admitted that the techniques had been far too complex for him to reproduce properly. Markham insisted that he attempt it anyway. Even an imperfect imitation would be enough if he simply showed whatever he could recall. Yoan watched the exchange and silently gave his approval. Markham immediately drew the sword at his waist and handed it to Danbake. Though embarrassed, Danbake accepted the weapon and tried to recall the scene in the cave. He warned them not to expect too much because he could not remember the details clearly. With that disclaimer, he began moving the sword. He attempted to imitate the mysterious swordsman's movements as he had seen them when the masked man fought the dragon turtle. Inside his mind, he forced himself to remember every detail he could. The result looked awkward. The sword cut repeatedly through empty air in a series of quick slashes. Rather than a proper martial technique, the movements resembled the clumsy practice of someone still learning basic sword swings. Hobom watched the display and thought the performance looked completely sloppy. However, Yoan and Markham reacted very differently. As they observed the movements more closely, realization struck both of them at the same time. The same words left their mouths simultaneously. They recognized it as the heavenly demon sword art. Markham's voice trembled with certainty as he declared that the masked man could only be one person. It had to be the former supreme heavenly demon. The Ganga Mountains, located along the border of Sichuan, were known for their treacherous terrain. Among their steep cliffs lay a notorious place called Death Valley. The valley had earned its grim name because of the violent currents rushing down from upstream. Anyone swept away by those waters had no chance of survival. On one of the steep cliffs overlooking Death Valley, a fierce battle was unfolding in a place no ordinary person would dare to climb. The clash of weapons rang sharply through the storm-filled air. The ground and cliffs surrounding the battlefield had already been torn apart by the intensity of the fight. Rain poured heavily from the sky. Despite the blinding downpour, dozens of figures wearing bamboo hats stood nearby, silently watching the confrontation. The battle was between the Blade Lord and a young man from the Unorthodox Alliance. Among the observers stood an old man with a white beard and a golden eye patch covering his left eye. Watching the fight, he expressed quiet amazement at the young man's courage, noting how remarkable it was for someone so young to face the Blade Lord with such confidence. A bald elder standing beside him agreed. Within his thoughts, he now understood why the Unorthodox Alliance and Hongyan had struggled so greatly that their faction eventually descended into civil war. A middle-aged man with a long scar across his face spoke next, dismissing the struggle. He pointed toward the battlefield and remarked that the Blade Lord had not moved even a single step during the entire fight. No matter how skilled the opponent might be, the difference between them was like throwing an egg against a rock. The elderly man responded thoughtfully. In his view, even if they were old and perhaps unable to fully understand the abilities of the younger generation, the young man's skill was still remarkable for someone of his age. The young warrior appeared to be in his early 30s. Despite his age, he had already reached a level of ability worthy of earning a title within the Zhonghu. Even after realizing during the battle that victory was impossible, he continued fighting with everything he had. The scarred man narrowed his eyes while observing him. Within his thoughts, he admitted that that the Jianghu was vast, yet the young man's competence at such an age was undeniable. It was understandable why the unorthodox alliance had suffered a severe setback because of him. The young strategist had managed to split the alliance into two factions, something that had never happened before. If he had continued to rise, he would undoubtedly have earned a prominent title within the unorthodox alliance. The man reflected that the Jianghu truly contained countless talents. Aside from the demon god, there was now another individual of similar age who possessed extraordinary skill. Yet the young man's fate was unfortunate. Encountering the Blade Lord before he had fully grown into his power had sealed his doom. On the battlefield, the young warrior felt growing frustration. Within his mind, he realized he was facing a monster. Even after the improvements he had made since his battle against the proud West King, he still could not force the Blade Lord to move even a single step. What he had believed would be an opportunity to eliminate the proud West King, Hang Yan's right-hand man, had turned into a fatal trap. Because of these mysterious warriors who had appeared out of nowhere, he now felt certain he would be the one to die instead. Until that moment, the Blade Lord had remained silent. Then he finally spoke. His calm voice questioned whether that was truly the extent of the young man's ability. The taunt twisted the young warrior's expression in anger. He could not even find words to respond. All he had managed to accomplish in the entire fight was slightly cutting the bamboo hat worn by the Blade Lord. The Blade Lord then remarked that he had been watching with interest, observing the techniques used during the battle. He stated that the young man had already used 38 different martial arts. The precision of the statement shocked everyone present. The Blade Lord asked calmly whether the young man had nothing more to show. The young warrior remained silent, unable to respond. Seeing no further resistance worth observing, the Blade Lord slowly sheathed his sword and declared that there was nothing more for him to see. Confusion flickered across the young man's face. At that moment, the Blade Lord's expression twisted into a faint grin. Suddenly, an immense surge of energy gathered around him. Sword chi condensed in the air and gradually took the shape of a blade. A sword formed entirely from sword chi. The sight stunned the young man. Before he could react, the condensed sword chi transformed into an air sword and shot forward toward his chest. The strike pierced through him instantly. A cry of agony burst from his mouth. Shock overwhelmed him as he realized what had happened. The technique was already terrifying enough as an invisible sword, but the fact that it had been manifested as an air sword revealed an even greater truth. The Blade Lord had already reached the life and death realm, the realm of a divine master. The young man's earlier intuition that he had no chance of victory had been completely correct. Clutching his pierced chest, he staggered backward. His steps faltered. Moments later, his body tumbled over the cliff and disappeared into the violent river currents below. The observers rushed to the edge of the cliff and looked down. Far below, the young warrior had already been swept away by the raging water. Hang Yeon's right-hand man, Gong Yun, laughed loudly as he looked down at the churning river. Within his words, he declared that the current would leave nothing behind, not even a body to recover. He praised the Blade Lord's strength, claiming that the young monster had been treated no differently from a child. At that moment, the scarred middle-aged man stepped forward between them. He calmly stated that nothing was impossible for their lord. Gong Yun turned toward him and confirmed his identity as Seng Dal, the leader of the Massacre Blade sect. He added that the Alliance head would be delighted to hear this news. Sang Dal replied that he was glad to hear that and reminded Gong Yun that they had fulfilled their part of the agreement. In return, he expected the unorthodox alliance to honor their side of the deal. Gong Yun grinned widely and assured him that they would. Now that the man who had been rebelling against the alliance head had been eliminated, all that remained was to deal with the others who had supported him. Meanwhile, the Blade Lord stood silently at the edge of the cliff. Within his thoughts, something continued to bother him. His formless chi blade control had pierced straight through the man's heart, and he had clearly sensed the victim's heartbeat stopping through his own true energy. Yet despite that certainty, a strange feeling lingered. Something about the outcome felt wrong, and the unease gnawed quietly at his mind. A man with a bandaged face hurried toward the Blade Lord through the pouring rain and called out to him. The Blade Lord turned toward him with a puzzled expression as the man quickly knelt on the rain-soaked ground. The Blade Lord demanded to know what had happened. The messenger reported reported that something had gone terribly wrong at the Northern Sea Ice Palace. Nearly all of the spies they had planted there had died. According to the information that had reached them, only 2 sect leaders and a single member of the Demon Iron Squad were still alive. The moment those words reached him, a violent surge of energy erupted from the Blade Lord's body. He had expected news from the Northern Sea, but he had never imagined hearing such disastrous results. With a sudden motion, he extended his hand. The kneeling messenger was instantly dragged forward by an invisible force and seized by the throat. The Blade Lord demanded an explanation, questioning why the plan had failed when the demon god had not interfered. Struggling for breath, the bandaged man revealed the truth. The dragon turtle had not been dead. The Blade Lord repeated the words in disbelief, asking whether the dragon turtle was truly alive. The messenger confirmed it with difficulty and added another shocking detail. The creature now possessed 4 heads, far different from the information they had previously known. When the Blade Lord released him, the man collapsed into coughing and gasping breaths. A faint smile slowly appeared on the Blade Lord's face. Within his reasoning, the existence of a 4-headed dragon turtle made sense. If the creature had remained sealed for centuries, its spiritual power would naturally have grown stronger during that time. Turning his attention to Sang-Dal, the leader of the Massacre Blade sect, he issued an order. Sang-Dal stepped forward immediately and answered with respect. The Blade Lord commanded him to take 20 men and retrieve the dragon turtle's innate core and its blood. The bandaged messenger reacted in alarm. 20 men represented half of the entire Demon Iron Squad. The Blade Lord dismissed the concern. That squad had been created precisely for such missions, and in his view, that number was sufficient. Sang-Dal hesitated for a moment and asked whether it was truly acceptable to entrust half of the squad to him. He had heard rumors that something dangerous might also be stirring within the Potala Palace. The Blade Lord's expression hardened as he questioned when Sang-Dal had begun doubting his orders. Immediately realizing his mistake, Sang-Dal bowed deeply and apologized, declaring that he would carry out the command without hesitation. The Blade Lord then instructed him not to worry about the matter concerning the Potala Palace, stating that he would personally handle it. Meanwhile, at the headquarters of the Orthodox Murim Alliance, a large force had gathered at the northern gate. More than 400 warriors stood assembled in organized rows. Among them were 100 elite fighters wearing light brown robes, the warriors of the Huangbo sect. Another group of 100 men wore thick white robes. They were the warriors of the Moyong sect, led by Moyong Kang. The remaining 200 fighters were clad in thin armor marked with the word Shadow on their backs. They belonged to the Blade Shadow Forces, one of the 4 major military divisions of the Murim Alliance. Kang So addressed Moyong Kang with gratitude, acknowledging that the Moyong sect's natural resistance to cold would be invaluable for the mission. Moyong Kang sighed heavily in response. He admitted that the only reason he had agreed to participate was out of respect for the Alliance head. Without Yi Mok's request, he would never have joined such a dangerous operation. Dan Jasung expressed his deep gratitude to all of them, thanking them sincerely for agreeing to assist the Northern Sea Ice Palace. Kang So declared that if the Berserk Saber of the 6 martial arts sect was pursuing the dragon turtle, then it was clear they were plotting something dangerous. Because of that, helping fellow Orthodox martial artists was only natural. Jigal Sohi praised him, noting that it had been thanks to Kang So's efforts that the masters had managed to reach an agreement. She added that once his older brother finished his secluded training and returned, he would surely evaluate Kang So's spirit highly. Kang So responded indifferently, stating that he had no need for his brother's approval. Jigal Sohi observed him quietly. Within her thoughts, she realized that nothing had changed between the brothers. Their relationship had never been good, and although she had briefly wondered if recent events might have softened the tension between them, it seemed she had been mistaken. Kang So then addressed the assembled warriors. He warned them that every minute was crucial and instructed them to prepare for an exhausting journey. They would rest as little as possible on their way to the Northern Sea, so everyone needed to carefully manage their stamina. The 400 warriors responded with a powerful shout. With a command to march, the force of Yulin warriors passed through the northern gate and began their long journey toward the Northern Sea. At the same time in Kaifeng, Danbake struck his forehead against the floor as he pleaded desperately for help. Within his mind, he believed that now that it had been confirmed the Jade Plaque belonged to the former supreme heavenly demon of the demonic cult, this was his best and only opportunity. Surely they would help him for that reason. However, Yowon questioned him calmly. According to Junwang, the Northern Sea Ice Palace maintained an alliance with the Orthodox Muram Alliance. Yowon asked why Danbake had not sought their help first. Danbake's heart sank. Within his thoughts, panic surfaced as he realized that his plan was not unfolding as he had imagined. He had originally intended to explain that part of the story while traveling to the Northern Sea. Yowon continued speaking. He acknowledged that he appreciated Danbake bringing news about the former Supreme Heavenly Demon, yet the situation still made little sense. The Northern Sea Ice Palace sending only a single envoy, especially someone of Danbake's rank, without even an official document requesting assistance, was highly suspicious. Yowon questioned how it could possibly make sense for a mere regular member of the Ice Palace to travel all the way to Zhongyuan without a formally signed request, especially when their palace master was already dead. Before Danbake could respond, his body was suddenly lifted from the ground by an invisible force. Yowon explained the logical conclusions. Unless someone was foolish, there were only two explanations. The first was that Danbake believed he was qualified to represent the Northern Sea Ice Palace himself. The second was that enemies existed within the Ice Palace, which meant Danbake was seeking help, not as its official representative, but as an individual acting on his own. Fear gripped Danbake. Within his thoughts, he realized he had completely misjudged Yowon. He had assumed the demonic cult leader was simply a martial artist with little intellect, but the man's insight was frighteningly sharp. Hiding anything further would only make matters worse. Danbake hurriedly explained that he had not intended to deceive them. Because of the urgency of the situation, he had been afraid that revealing the truth from the start might cause them to reject his request. Yowon asked him directly what he had been hiding. After a moment of hesitation, Danbake revealed the truth. He was the successor of the Northern Sea Ice Palace. Hobom immediately blurted out that he had known it all along. Danbake expressed astonishment at Yowon's sharp insight and asked for forgiveness. Yowon responded coldly, remarking that Danbake had acted boldly. He stated that if the successor of the Northern Sea Ice Palace had not been the one who proved that the former Supreme Heavenly Demon was still alive, Danbake would have paid a severe price for such a reckless oversight. Though Yowon spoke casually, fear spread through Danbake's body. Danbake immediately declared that he would hide nothing further. He explained that just as Yowon had assumed, the envoy carrying the official request document had already gone to the Orthodox Muram Alliance. Hobom reacted with disbelief, realizing that if the demonic cult agreed to help and traveled to the Northern Sea, they would simply end up interfering with the Orthodox Muram Alliance's efforts. Wang Huo then questioned the situation, noting that if Danbake truly was the successor of the Ice Palace Master, he should naturally be acting as the palace's proxy. Danbake admitted that according to the rules, this would normally be true. However, the acting proxy was not him, but the Vice Palace Master, his second uncle, Dan Juchen. Yowon pointed out that this meant Danbake had come to the demonic cult seeking help without any official permission. Danbake nervously explained that he had no other choice, revealing that spies were still present within the Ice Palace. Yowon asked whether those spies belonged to the Berserk Saber of the Six Martial Arts sect. Danbake confirmed the suspicion and explained that the most suspicious figures were Vice Palace Master Dan Juchen and the followers surrounding him. After the Palace Master's death and the release of the Dragon Turtle, the very first action taken by those individuals had been to call a meeting to appoint Dan Juchen as the temporary Palace Master. Danbake revealed that he had been unconscious for 2 days due to his internal injuries, which prevented him from interfering. During that time, Dan Juchen used the chaos caused by the Dragon Turtle's release to consolidate the forces of the Northern Sea Ice Palace under his control. As a result, he was now being treated as a hero. Wang Huo admitted that the situation certainly sounded suspicious, but he pointed out that such behavior did not necessarily prove someone was a spy. It could simply be a man seeking power. Danbake responded firmly. He stated that neither he nor his father would object if Dan Juchen had pursued the position honestly, because the man possessed enough skill to qualify. However, exploiting the palace's vulnerable state to seize power was something entirely different. He asked Wang Hul whether the demonic cult would dismiss such actions as mere political struggle if the same thing had happened within their own ranks. Within Wang Hul's thoughts, he acknowledged that Danbake's reasoning was not entirely wrong. The Berserk Saber of the Six Martial Arts sect had once used a similar method against the demonic cult. Danbake continued explaining that the third elder had long been known as the right hand of the Vice Palace Master, and that the decision to purchase explosives from the Berserk Saber of the Six Martial Arts sect had been made by the Vice Palace Master and his faction. Before Danbake could continue further, Yo-Won cut him off. Yo-Won declared that there was no need to hear more. Regardless of the internal politics of the Ice Palace, the demonic cult intended to travel to the Northern Sea to secure the safety of the former Supreme Heavenly Demon. Relief and excitement flooded Danbake as he expressed his gratitude. However, Yo-Won added one condition before anything else. He stated that a contract would first need to be established. Danbake was startled by the proposal. Confusion filled his expression as he pointed out that the safety of the demonic cult's former Supreme Heavenly Demon depended on this matter. Yo-Won warned Danbake not to misunderstand the situation. He explained that if the demonic cult traveled to the Northern Sea without an official request, they would inevitably come into conflict with both the Vice Palace Master and the Orthodox Murim Alliance. If they failed to find the former Supreme Heavenly Demon, or if he had already died, then the entire journey would have been meaningless. Within his thoughts, Danbake finally understood the reason. Yo-Won needed a clear justification for his presence. If the man who had saved Danbake had already died at the hands of the dragon turtle and no body remained, the demonic cult would have no valid explanation for their involvement. Danbake admitted that he could sign a contract with the cult leader, but he possessed no real authority within the Ice Palace. The Vice Palace Master could easily declare such an agreement invalid. He cautiously asked whether that would still be acceptable. Yo-Won responded that it did not matter. Danbake was stunned by the indifferent reply, yet he decided it was better to accept before Yo-Won changed his mind. He picked up the brush placed on the table and looked toward Yo-Won. Danbake asked what kind of contract it would be. Yo-Won answered calmly that it was simple. Danbake only needed to promise 3 things. Danbake was surprised that there were 3 conditions and asked what they were. Yo-Won began listing them. First, once the dragon turtle was defeated, its innate core and blood would belong to the Heavenly Demon Divine cult. Danbake reacted with shock at the condition that followed the dragon turtle's defeat. Yo-Won confirmed it firmly. Then Yo-Won stated the second condition. Once the dragon turtle matter was resolved, the Northern Sea Ice Palace would sever its alliance with the Orthodox Murim Alliance. Before Danbake could recover from the shock, Yo-Won delivered the final condition. The Northern Sea Ice Palace would form an alliance with the Heavenly Demon Divine cult. Yo-Won instructed him to write down those 3 conditions. Danbake fell completely silent, unable to respond. Yo-Won declared that if Danbake agreed to those conditions, the demonic cult would depart for the Northern Sea immediately. Panicked, Danbake protested that those matters were far beyond his authority to decide. Yo-Won dismissed his concern calmly, stating that Danbake would soon become the Palace Master. Danbake trembled at those sudden words. The embarrassment he had felt earlier transformed into something deeper as Yo-Won's lips curved into a faint smile. Yo-Won addressed him decisively, urging him to make his decision as the future Palace Master. Several hours later, Yo-Won emerged from the guest room and issued orders to his subordinates. He instructed them to summon the 6 swords immediately because they would be departing. With that command, the demonic cult's expedition toward the Northern Sea was officially set in motion. The northern lands belong to the Jianghu. They mark the borders of Shanxi, Gansu, and Hebei. To reach Lake Baikal, where the Northern Sea Ice Palace stood, travelers had to cross the vast Great Plains ruled by numerous savage tribes. Because of the urgency of the situation, the 400 elite martial artists of the Orthodox Murim Alliance traveled without rest. After 3 relentless days of marching, they finally arrived at the borders of the Great Plains. Throughout the journey, the commander Kang So remained silent, his expression heavy with concern. The reason for his unease was the unexpected news he had heard while traveling north. Dan Juzong had informed them that someone from the Ice Palace had already sought help from the demonic cult. However, it had not been an official request like the one delivered to the Murim Alliance. The successor had acted independently, meaning the demonic cult would likely refuse such an improper appeal. After explaining the situation, Dan Juzong excused himself, stating that he was exhausted and hoped the others would rest well. Left behind, mind, Kang So admitted that he had not expected such a development. Moyong Kang dismissed the matter calmly, reasoning that since the request had not been official, there was no reason for concern. A leader of a great organization would never act recklessly without proper justification. From his perspective, the demonic cult would certainly refuse the request. Jagal Sohi agreed with that logic. She pointed out that the demonic cult was currently focused on establishing its foundation in Kaifeng, and dividing its forces would bring them no advantage. However, she hesitated before continuing. Kang So immediately questioned what she meant. Jagal Sohi explained that while Moyong Kong's reasoning made sense from a strategist's perspective, the demonic cult leader was not a man who behaved according to ordinary expectations. Still, she reminded them that the Murim Alliance and the demonic cult were currently allied. Even if the demonic cult decided to head toward the Northern Sea Ice Palace, there was technically nothing to fear. Kang So responded with a cold question. He wondered if she would still speak so calmly if the dragon turtle's innate core, or even its corpse filled with spiritual power, ended up in the hands of the demonic cult. Moyong Kong was startled by the mention of the innate core. Jagal Sohi attempted to interrupt, insisting there was no need to discuss rights over the dragon turtle's core at that moment. Kang So cut her off sharply, his voice rising with anger. He pointed out that Yan Buso had lost his arm to the demonic cult leader, yet his own fiancée was sitting there calmly speaking of alliances. He accused her of lacking backbone and questioned whether she had already yielded to evil. Jagal Sohi immediately retaliated, demanding to know what he was implying. Kang So coldly stated that he had nothing more to say to her. Jagal Sohi felt deeply insulted and nearly shouted in anger, but Kang So ignored her entirely and ordered the march to accelerate. She suppressed the rage rising inside her. Although she harbored resentment toward Yowon for severing her fiancé's arm, she also understood her responsibility. As the strategist responsible for the military plans of the Murim Alliance, she knew that allowing personal emotions to interfere with duty would be the height of foolishness. Within her thoughts, she wondered if Kang So remained so tense because he feared that the demonic cult might dispatch troops. As the days passed, Kang So grew even more silent. Watching his expression, it seemed clear that he was deeply troubled by the unfolding strategic situation. As Jagal Sohi rode forward on her horse, her gaze stretched across the vast northern land. The endless plains spread before them, signaling their arrival at the Great Plains. She announced that they had reached the domain of the barbarians and informed Commander Kang So that they were entering the Great Plains. At her words, Moyong Kong's expression stiffened. Unlike the Jagal and Huangbo clans that resided deep within Jianghu, the Moyong clan had long been settled in Liaoning in the far north. Because of this, they were far more familiar with the barbarian tribes of the plains. Though those tribes were not martial artists, they were seasoned warriors capable of fighting through all 4 seasons. Moyong Kong knew that they did not fight as individual masters, but as massive war bands. That was the only reason he felt uneasy. If the barbarians decided to wage war and arrived with their armies, the situation could quickly become dangerous. Within his thoughts, Moyong Kong felt relieved that Kang So had been chosen as the commander. He had heard that Kang So and the Black Shadow forces had spent 5 years fighting barbarian tribes along the northern borders of Shanxi. Reflecting further, Moyong Kong remembered hearing that Kang So had recently reached an agreement with the chief of the Great Hung clan. The many treasure chests loaded in the rear carriage were likely prepared as tribute in case they encountered the tribes. He silently hoped that nothing would happen during their passage. For half a day, the journey continued without incident. Then, as the afternoon sun began to sink toward the horizon, the sound of thunderous hooves suddenly shook the earth. The marching column of the Orthodox Murim Alliance halted instantly. No command had yet been given, but every warrior stopped at the same time and turned their eyes toward the horizon. In the glow of the setting sun, a massive force filled the distant plains. Thousands of galloping horses pounded the ground, causing the earth itself to tremble like an earthquake. Dan Jusong, the envoy from the Northern Sea Ice Palace riding beside Kang So, recognized them immediately. The grayish-brown wolf fur worn by the approaching riders marked them clearly as the warriors of the Great Hung clan. The deep blast of horns echoed across the plains. Tension spread through the ranks of the Orthodox warriors, who stood ready to advance. At that moment, Kang So calmly raised his hand in a signal. He ordered the Black Shadow flag to be raised. The lieutenant of the Black Shadow forces relayed the command, command, and the warriors at the front immediately lifted the flag high. Observing the approaching riders, Moyonkong noticed that although a vast army stood behind them, only a few dozen riders were advancing toward their position. Within his thoughts, he acknowledged their boldness. One figure in particular drew his attention. The man was so enormous that even the blood-red warhorse beneath him appeared small in comparison. Recognizing the figure, Kang So spoke a single name, Azra. At that name, Moyonkong and Don Jusong's eyes widened in shock. Azra was the war chief of the Great Hung clan. His name and reputation were widely known across the lands, yet few people had ever actually seen his face. When Azra approached, Kang So greeted him politely. Azra welcomed him warmly, remarking that it had been a long time since they last met. At Kang So's signal, the Black Shadow warriors standing behind him moved toward the rear carriage and brought forward 10 brightly colored chests. The boxes were set down heavily on the ground. When the lids were opened, they revealed numerous treasures and gold ingots. Azra observed the contents with clear satisfaction and nodded approvingly. Kang So then explained their purpose, stating that the Murim Alliance intended to cross the Great Plains in order to reach the Northern Sea. Azra responded casually that there was no need to worry about the journey. Nearby, Moyonkong quietly asked Dan Jusong whether he could understand the language being spoken. Dan Jusong confirmed that he could. Since the Northern Sea and the Great Plains bordered one another, their people frequently interacted and often clashed, so he was familiar with the language of the tribes. Within his thoughts, Moyonkang felt relieved. If communication was possible, then passing safely through the Great Plains and reaching the Northern Sea Ice Palace should not be difficult. However, he noticed that the conversation between Kang So and Azra was continuing longer than expected. Suddenly, Azra's voice rose sharply. Jagal So he sensed that something was wrong. Kang So began speaking with numerous gestures, as if requesting something important. Meanwhile, Azra and the man standing beside him, who appeared to be his lieutenant, started arguing among themselves. Concerned, Jagal Soe asked Dan Jusong if he could explain what they were discussing. Dan Jusong hesitated before answering. He explained that Kang So had asked the Great Hung clan to block anyone other than the Orthodox Murim Alliance from passing through the Great Plains. Shock spread across Jagal Sohe's face as she understood what he was trying to do. After the negotiations concluded, the Orthodox Murim Alliance resumed their march toward the north. Behind them, Sarachu, the left arm of Azra and the second strongest warrior of the Great Hung clan, spoke to his chief. He questioned whether Azra truly intended to accept Kang So's proposal. Azra asked him whether he had become frightened simply because the Murim Alliance warriors came from Jianghu. He expressed surprise at Sarachu's hesitation, considering how many battles they had fought together over the years. Sarachu admitted that the people of Jianghu were indeed dangerous. He reminded Azra of the news that their warrior Bu Choi had recently brought from Zhongyuan. Azra called out loudly for Bu Choi. Azra questioned him about the news he had brought earlier. He asked whether the forces currently fighting for power in Zhongyuan's Jianghu were the demonic cult and the berserk saber of the Six Martial Arts sect. Bu Choi confirmed that this was correct. He further explained that the leader of the demonic cult was so powerful that people had begun calling him the demon god. Azra repeated the title with disdain. He remarked that it was an arrogant name and scoffed at the idea that an ordinary human could dare to call himself a god. Because of the Great Hung clan's frequent conflicts with the warriors of Jianghu and their attempts to invade Zhongyuan's territories, the clan's former chief had naturally developed an interest in martial arts. Over the course of 3 generations, spies and observers were sent into Zhongyuan to study the martial world. Through those efforts, the Great Hung clan eventually built an army composed of martial artists and warriors, allowing them to dominate the Great Plains. Azra reminded them of something Kang So had said earlier, that the demonic cult leader was the only truly dangerous individual among them, and that he likely would not appear in this situation anyway. Sarachu admitted that this was probably true, though he still felt uneasy. Azra dismissed the concern. He stated confidently that there would be no conflict with the Jianghu warriors. Sarachu asked whether he had a plan. Azra revealed it with a quiet laugh. Since Kang So had requested that no other martial artist be allowed to pass through the Great Plains, Azra intended to simply block the path. With 50,000 warriors of the Great Hung clan stationed in the plains, even martial artists would hesitate to challenge them. If their soldiers unleashed a volley of arrows, the sky itself would darken beneath the storm of arrows. In his view, no martial artists would be reckless enough to confront such overwhelming numbers. Sriracha understood that Azra planned to frighten any approaching martial artists into retreating. Azra confirmed that this was exactly his intention. As long as they avoided direct conflict, he believed the so-called Demon Lord would have no reason to travel all the way to the Great Plains to confront them. Sriracha praised the strategy, noting that if everything went according to plan, their tribe would receive the 3,000 sheep promised by Kang So without suffering any losses. Azra laughed loudly, pleased with the outcome, remarking that the situation would allow them to gain two benefits with a single move. While they were laughing, a messenger wearing yellow feathered fur approached quickly. The man bowed respectfully and delivered urgent news. About 20 miles to the southwest, a force of roughly 600 armed men was advancing north. Azra asked whether they were warriors from another tribe. The messenger answered that they were not. Judging by their attire, the approaching group appeared to be martial artists from Jianghu. At this report, Azra and his men's eyes gleamed with interest. The expected visitors were arriving sooner than anticipated. Night soon fell across the plains. Under the darkness, 600 warriors marched northward in 5 disciplined rows, their torches lighting the path ahead. They were the warriors of the demonic cult, their banners proudly displaying the word demon. At the front of each group of 100 warriors rode the 6 swords of the demonic cult. Suddenly, Yowon gave an order. He commanded the army to halt. At once, the advancing demonic cult forces stopped their march. Markham asked Yowon if something was wrong. Confusion spread among the warriors as they wondered why the march had suddenly stopped. The reason quickly became clear. The thunder of countless horse hooves shook the ground. From the northern horizon, where the demonic cult had intended to travel, an ocean of torches appeared in the darkness. The light stretched across the night sky and steadily advanced closer. At a glance, the approaching force looked like an army of 10,000. They were the warriors of the Great Hung clan, the dominant power of the northern plains. Danbake stared in shock, unable to understand why they had appeared. Even though the tribes of the plains were known as savages, they rarely mobilized their entire military unless they were engaged in territorial wars against other tribes. At the front of the Great Hung forces rode Azra and Sriracha. Azra laughed loudly, remarking that the demonic cult had arrived within a single day, which meant less waiting for them. Sriracha commented that it was an unfortunate coincidence. If these warriors had arrived before the Orthodox Murim alliance, they might have been allowed to pass through the plains after paying the appropriate tribute. Azra agreed with a laugh, declaring that the demonic cult was simply unlucky. In his view, the only option was to send them back the way they came. He called for Buchoi. Buchoi stepped forward immediately. Azra ordered him to warn the approaching warriors that they were not permitted to pass. If they refused to turn back toward Zhongyuan, they would lose their lives to the blades of the Great Hung clan's warriors. Receiving the command, Buchoi rode forward and shouted toward the 600 demonic cult warriors standing in the distance. He declared loudly that they were the Great Hung clan, the warriors who ruled the Great Plains, and introduced himself as Buchoi, servant of their ruler, the Great War Chief Azra. He proclaimed that the plains belonged to their people and warned the outsiders to return to Zhongyuan immediately. If they refused, their lives would be taken by the clan's blades. Behind him, the barbarian warriors roared in unison. Even though many of them did not fully understand the words being spoken, their shouts amplified the threat and intimidation. Watching the scene, Danbake became visibly anxious. He explained that the Great Hung clan ruled the entire Great Plains and that they were extremely dangerous. Markham observed the overwhelming number of enemy warriors and pointed out that their forces were far too large for the demonic cult to fight head-on. The 6th Elder, Mong Mu, agreed. Engaging them in battle would lead to heavy losses. Yowon remained silent as he studied the situation. Within his thoughts, he concluded that the enemy forces outnumbered them by more than 100 times. Fighting here would only waste both energy and manpower. He then asked NANO to analyze the language the barbarians were speaking. NANO responded that the language was closely related to Mongolian and confirmed that it could translate it. Yowon ordered NANO to proceed with the translation. NANO transferred the translated Mongolian language directly into Yowon's mind. Through the translation, Yowon understood the taunts of the Hung Clan warriors. They were shouting insults, telling the outsiders to disappear before they were skewered by their weapons. Within his thoughts, Yowon realized that the barbarians were speaking freely because they believed the demonic cult could not understand them. Their intention was not necessarily to start a battle, but simply to prevent anyone from passing through the Great Plains. Yowon nudged his horse forward slightly. His sudden movement puzzled the subordinates behind him, who wondered what he intended to do. Without hesitation, Yowon raised his voice and projected it with powerful internal energy toward the massive army of the Great Hung Clan. He called out for the Great Hung Clan to listen. The force of his voice pierced through the battlefield, causing many of the Hung Clan warriors to cover their ears from the overwhelming pressure. Even more shocking than the power of his voice was the language he spoke. The words coming from Yowon's mouth were spoken perfectly in the language of the Hung Clan. The barbarian warriors were stunned, and the demonic cult members behind Yowon were equally shocked. Danbake was the most astonished of all. He could not understand how Yowon was speaking the language of the plains so fluently. Yowon declared his identity clearly. He announced himself as the leader of the heavenly demon divine cult, introducing himself as Chun Yowon. At that declaration, Sriracha froze in terror as he recognized the name. He realized that the man before them was the one known as the demon god. Azra was equally stunned. Kang So had assured him that the demonic cult leader would never come personally, yet the man standing before them was claiming exactly that. Yowon continued speaking calmly. He acknowledged that the Great Plains belonged to the Great Hung Clan and explained that he had brought tribute as a sign of respect. He emphasized that the demonic cult had not come to wage war and wished to avoid conflict. Hearing this, Azra clenched his teeth in frustration as suspicion rose within him. He began to wonder whether Kang So had deceived him. The Great Hung Clan's military captain Okuro stepped forward with skepticism. He argued that the claim made no sense. The leader of the demonic cult ruled Zhongyuan, so why would such a powerful figure travel all the way to the Great Plains? Sriracha responded carefully, urging the war chief to make his decision wisely. The demonic cult did not know that the Hung Clan had already heard rumors about the demon god, yet Yowon had openly revealed his identity anyway. That alone made it likely that he was telling the truth. Azra remained suspicious. Yowon not only spoke their language, but spoke it exceptionally well. He began to wonder if another tribe might have helped the demonic cult learn their language. Sriracha admitted that this possibility also existed and acknowledged that it was indeed strange for the demonic cult leader to know their language. Okuro grew impatient and demanded permission to command the warriors. He argued that regardless of whether they were martial artists from Zhonghu, the Hung Clan could easily slaughter them and leave their bodies for the crows. Azra fell into deep contemplation. There were only 600 demonic cult warriors before them, while the Hung Clan had tens of thousands. Martial artists might be powerful, but their internal energy and stamina were not limitless. The only thing troubling him was the frightening rumor surrounding the demon god. Sriracha once again suggested caution. Yowon had only asked to pass through their territory, and this was not a tribal war. There was no need to provoke unnecessary conflict. Okuro began protesting again, angrily arguing that the Great Hung Clan had never feared any enemy. Before he could finish speaking, Buchoi suddenly rode back toward them and reported urgently. He declared that the man truly appeared to be the demon god. Azra frowned in confusion and demanded an explanation. Buchoi stepped forward and revealed the reason for his sudden certainty. He explained that the internal energy contained within Yowon's voice was beyond anything he had ever experienced. The sheer power behind those words made it impossible for him to even imagine how much internal energy that man possessed. Within his thoughts, Azra began to reconsider the situation. If the rumors about the demon god were true, even the Great Hung Clan might suffer severe losses despite their overwhelming numbers. Okuro, however, grew increasingly irritated. He accused the war chief of hesitating out of fear over mere martial arts. In his eyes, rumors about outsiders were always exaggerated. He demanded command over 3,000 warriors and confidently declared that he would slaughter every one of the 600 enemies. Another warrior stepped forward and supported Okuro's claim. He insisted that the Great Hung Clan could not retreat simply because of meaningless rumors. Within his thoughts, Azra understood the root of their anger. Many warriors had long been dissatisfied that the squads trained in martial arts were always placed on the front lines. After a moment of consideration, Azra made his decision. He asked Sriracha whether the warriors taken from the Yada clan were stationed in the rear ranks. Sriracha confirmed that they were. Azra then granted Okuro command over 2,000 2,000 Yada warriors along with 3 captains. If Okuro was so confident in his strength, he would be given the chance to prove that his confidence was justified. Okuro struck his chest proudly and vowed that he would not disappoint his chief. At once, he shouted the order to charge. Filled with excitement, Okuro spurred his horse forward, and the warriors under his command surged forward behind him. Watching the advance, Azra smiled quietly within his thoughts. If the man truly was the demon god, this confrontation would reveal the truth. Meanwhile, Yoan and his subordinates waited silently for a response. Dan Bake's voice trembled with anxiety. He feared that they had failed to persuade the barbarians. The difference in numbers was enormous, and he wondered whether they would even survive long enough to reach the Northern Sea Ice Palace. Wang Hul stepped forward boldly and declared that the demonic cult was not afraid. If Yoan gave the order, they would attack immediately. Yoan calmly told them to wait. He acknowledged that their attempt to convince the Great Hung clan had failed, but there was still something he wanted to try. With that, Yoan slowly guided his horse forward. Munku watched anxiously as Yoan rode forward. Within her heart, concern grew as she wondered what he intended to do. Meanwhile, Okuro closed the distance with his forces. He mocked the title of demon god, dismissing it as nothing more than foolish rumors. Confident in the strength of his warriors, he declared that Yoan would be sent to hell beneath a storm of arrows. The young commanders around him shouted in agreement and ordered their archers to prepare. At the command to fire, the warriors released their arrows. Thousands of arrows shot forward at once, surging toward the demonic cult like a violent storm. Amid the chaos, Yoan remained perfectly calm. He raised his internal energy and extended it toward the incoming arrows, infusing them with his power. In the next moment, the 2,000 arrows froze in mid-air. The warriors of the Great Hung clan halted their charge in disbelief. With a gentle wave of his outstretched hand, Yoan changed the direction of the suspended arrows. The arrows slowly turned around and pointed back toward the Hung clan warriors. Okuro's face paled. Realizing what was about to happen, he shouted for his men to scatter, but it was already too late. The arrows shot forward once again. One after another, the arrows struck their marks, piercing hearts and skulls with perfect precision. Cries of shock and agony echoed across the plains as the warriors fell. Okuro stared in disbelief. Within his fading thoughts, he finally realized the truth. Before he could say anything further, an arrow pierced through his head, and his body fell lifeless from his horse. From afar, War Chief Azra and the other commanders watched in stunned silence. The 2,000 warriors who had charged so confidently were wiped out in an instant. All of it had happened with a single gesture. Azra trembled as the horrifying truth sank in. Every rumor they had heard was real. Within Dan Bake's thoughts, overwhelming shock surged. The stories that claimed the demonic cult leader could soar through the heavens and summon thunder were not exaggerations. The man truly was worthy of the title Demon God. Sarachu urgently begged Azra to reconsider. If the man before them truly was the demon god, they could not fight him under any circumstances. The only choice was to allow the demonic cult to pass. Azra immediately agreed and ordered Buchoi to deliver the message that they wished to avoid conflict. But Buchoi did not respond. Azra called out to him again. Instead of answering, Buchoi stood frozen, his face pale, as he stared at something ahead. Azra followed his gaze. The moment he saw what Buchoi was looking at, his expression froze. Yoan was already standing right in front of them. In a cold voice, Yoan addressed Sarachu, recognizing him as the vice chief. Within Buchoi's thoughts, terror gripped him completely. He had been watching Yoan the entire time, yet somehow lost sight of him during the approach. The realization struck him like lightning. If that monster wished it, he could kill every one of them at any moment. The warriors around Azra shouted urgently, rushing forward to protect their war chief. Weapons were drawn as they formed a barrier in front of him. Yoan slowly raised his palm and turned it downward. At that instant, a powerful vibration surged outward in every direction. An immense pressure descended upon the battlefield, forcing both horses and men to collapse to the ground, unable to stand. Yoan briefly cleared his throat. The strain from earlier shouting had irritated it, but the sensation now felt far more comfortable. Great Chief Azra of the Great Hung clan was a man born with extraordinary strength and authority. Through countless battles, he had unified numerous tribes and risen to the highest position among the peoples of the Great Plains. The vast territory he ruled was even larger than Zhongyuan itself, and his power was so great that even the Orthodox Murim alliance treated him with caution. For years, Azra had feared nothing. His army was strong enough to threaten Zhongyuan itself. That confidence vanished the moment he encountered the demon god, Chun Yowon. The sight before him was unbelievable. With a single motion of his hand, Yowon had slaughtered 2,000 warriors. Now Azra found himself crushed against the ground alongside his horse by an invisible force. Crawling helplessly under that pressure was something he had never experienced before. For the first time in his life, the great chief of the Great Hung clan felt true fear. Nearby commanders rushed to his side after he fell from his horse, shouting desperately for his protection. Azra raised both hands to show that he had no intention of fighting. He addressed Yowon as Demon God, asking for a chance to speak. Hearing the title Demon God, Yowon frowned slightly. The name was a new one given to him after he had become recognized as one of the 5 greatest warriors. The surrounding warriors shouted in panic, warning him not to come any closer and insisting that they had nothing more to say. Yowon responded with a simple wave of his hand. The motion appeared light, yet Sarachu's body was instantly thrown backward as though he were nothing more than a piece of paper caught in the wind. Now standing face to face with Yowon, Azra struggled to find the words needed to negotiate. Yowon asked a single question. He demanded to know who had instigated them. The question struck Azra with shock. He could not understand how Yowon had immediately sensed that someone else had influenced their actions. In that moment, he could not help but wonder if the man before him truly possessed the power of a god. Azra hurriedly explained that their true intention had only been to intimidate the outsiders and force them to retreat. They had never truly intended to start a battle. Within his thoughts, Yowon reflected on the situation. He had initially questioned Azra because the man had known the title Demon God, which made him suspicious. Now it appeared that someone truly had been manipulating events from behind the scenes. Yowon demanded that Azra explain everything clearly. Azra revealed that the instigator was Kang So, the second son of the Orthodox Miram Alliance's leader. Inside his mind, Azra made a quick decision. Since Kang So had deceived them as well, there was no reason to remain loyal to him or keep his involvement secret. In fact, Azra felt that Kang So deserved to suffer for the disaster that had followed. Azra hurriedly explained that the Miram Alliance forces had arrived before the demonic cult. In exchange for 3,000 sheep, Kang So had asked the Great Hung clan to block any forces heading toward the Northern Sea except for his own army. Their intention had only been to intimidate the approaching group and force them to retreat. They had never intended to fight. He insisted that if Kang So had not lied by claiming that the demonic cult leader would never come personally, the confrontation would never have happened. The deaths of 2,000 warriors had occurred entirely because of that deception. Azra promised that the Great Hung clan would immediately clear the path and urged Yowon to continue on his way without delay. Yowon listened and gave a faint smile before nodding slightly. Within his thoughts, Azra felt relief flood through him. He believed he had successfully negotiated their survival. If Yowon continued north and confronted Kang So, the situation might even turn to Azra's advantage. Encouraged by that belief, Azra began praising Yowon, addressing him as the demon god and the hero of the Great Plains. But before he could finish his words, a flash of force chi cut through the air. A sharp metallic sound echoed as his weapon fell to the ground. His arm had been severed along with it. A terrible scream burst from Azra's mouth as unbearable pain surged through him. The surrounding warriors cried out in shock. Yowon spoke coldly. He pointed out that even if Azra now tried to end the matter peacefully, it did not erase the fact that the Great Hung clan had attacked first. Azra struggled to respond, but no words came. Yowon suddenly grabbed his hair and forced his head upward. Azra cried out in pain. Yowon stated that if he had not been present, the demonic cult's forces would have been slaughtered by the attack. Yet Azra was now attempting to shift all responsibility onto Kang So. Terrified, Azra desperately begged for mercy. He insisted again that without Kang So's proposal, they never would have blocked the demonic cult's path. Yowon then addressed the surrounding warriors. He acknowledged that Kang So had indeed caused the situation. The loss of their chief's 2 arms was entirely due to the schemes of the Orthodox Miram Alliance's Kang So. The word struck Azra with terror. When Yowon mentioned 2 arms, Azra staggered backward in dread. With a cruel smile, Yowon lunged forward and told him to direct all his hatred toward Kang So. Azra desperately tried to stop him, begging the demon god to wait. But the plea came too late. A slash of force chi cut through the air and passed through his other shoulder. A horrifying scream shattered the quiet night as Azra's second arm was severed. The cry carried deep resentment. Far away, Commander Kang So, leading the Morim Alliance forces northward, suddenly felt a chill run down his spine. He could not understand the cause of the uneasy sensation. At that moment, Jigal Sohi spoke beside him, wondering aloud whether anyone else had heard a scream in the distance. Her words unsettled Kang So even more, though he could not explain why. Beyond the Great Wall, further north than the Great Plains, lies a region many believe to be covered by endless snowstorms throughout the year. In truth, the land is far more diverse. Dense coniferous forests spread across the landscape, mountains rise sharply, and wide meadows stretch across the cold terrain. Within this land rests a vast body of water known as Lake Baikal. The lake is so enormous that it surpasses all the lakes of Zhongyuan combined. The place is known by many names: the Holy Sea, the Blue Eyes of the Cold Land, and the Sanctuary of the Northern Sea. At its center lies a massive island, so large that it hardly seems like an island at all. Across that island stand small mountains and wide fields. Between the southeastern mountain peaks rises a great palace built like a fortress. Its magnificent appearance is often compared to the headquarters of the Miram Alliance. This is the Northern Sea Ice Palace. To the northwest of the palace lies Seal Turtle Island. The island is surrounded by barren mountains, and among them stands the tallest peak. At the base of that mountain lies the entrance to a cave that had cracked open from violent vibrations. The cave stretches far deeper than it first appears. Within it lies an enormous chamber formed entirely of blue ice. The ice-like stones forming the chamber are called adularia stones, rare minerals that become harder and more durable as the cold intensifies. Numerous torches illuminated the vast cavern. Nearly 500 warriors of the Northern Sea Ice Palace, dressed in white fur, knelt across the chamber with their hands pressed firmly against the frozen floor. Each of them continuously poured cold chi into the ice stone beneath them. The second elder of the Ice Palace, O Mubong, urged them to endure a little longer. Another group would soon arrive to replace them, and until then, they had to continue injecting cold chi into the Adularia stone. Within his thoughts, Mubang struggled with exhaustion. He had been maintaining the effort for 6 straight hours, and even he was reaching his limit. Despite their constant efforts, the crack in the ice stone continued to grow wider. If they stopped for even a moment, the monstrous creature sealed beneath the Adularia would break through and escape. Since being released from its ancient seal, the dragon turtle's strength and spiritual power had continued to increase, while the warriors attempting to contain it were gradually weakening. Just then, a new group of 500 warriors arrived at the cave entrance to relieve them. The fifth elder, Seol Yijong, announced their arrival and declared that they had come to take over the shift. Mubang apologized that they had to begin immediately, even though they had only just recovered their internal chi through circulation techniques. However, he admitted that the current group could no longer endure the strain. Yijong responded that they had already sensed the worsening situation while approaching the cave. The vibrations had become so powerful that they could be felt even from the palace. Mubang grimly suggested that perhaps it would be better to gather every warrior from the palace and confront the dragon turtle directly. Yijong urged him to endure a little longer. Once the forces of the Morim Alliance arrived, they would have no choice but to fight the monster together regardless. Frustration surged through Mubang, and he cursed the outsiders in anger. Yijong quickly cautioned him, reminding him that many people were listening and that he should be careful with his words. But Mubang could no longer hold back his resentment. He demanded to know how much longer they were expected to sacrifice themselves while waiting for the outsiders to arrive. While the second elder Omubang voiced his anger, a warrior suddenly rushed toward the cave entrance and shouted with urgency that the forces of the Murim Alliance had finally arrived. Far away from the cavern at the southeastern dock of the Northern Sea Ice Palace, the vast waters of Lake Baikal stretched endlessly. The lake was so immense that it resembled a sea rather than a simple lake. Along the dock, many officials of the Northern Sea Ice Palace had gathered while watching the approaching ships. The first elder, Seol Youngi, spoke while observing the distant vessels and remarked that they were finally visible. The palace had been approaching its limit and their arrival was a relief. At the same time, he expressed a grim hope that Danbake was not aboard those ships. Beside him stood Dan Juchin, the acting proxy of the palace master. Though the two men had chosen different paths in the palace's internal conflict, Dan Juchin firmly reminded Youngi that Danbake was still his nephew. He had personally taught the boy martial arts and the the Ice White Divine Arts, and he demanded that the First Elder show respect when speaking of the young master. Youngi remained unmoved by the rebuke. He argued that his statement was merely the truth. In his view, the palace would unite more easily if Danbake were gone, and he even stated that it might be better if the demonic cult were to eliminate him. Dan Jushin angrily shouted at the First Elder for such words. Youngi continued regardless, insisting that Dan Yuchen himself should understand the situation. The former palace master had insisted that Danbake be named successor, and Youngi believed that decision had led them into their current crisis. In his opinion, the former master had been mistaken in believing that recovering the lost divine relic would change the fate of the Ice Palace. However, as Youngi continued speaking, he suddenly noticed that Dan Juchin's attention had shifted elsewhere across the lake. Confused, Youngi asked what he was looking at. Dan Juchin calmly responded that their earlier prediction appeared to be completely wrong and told him to look carefully toward the distant water. Dozens of ships carrying the Murim Alliance forces were already crossing Lake Baikal toward the palace. Yet from the opposite direction, another group of ships was also approaching. At first, they were too far away to see clearly, but the dark banners gradually became visible. Dan Juchin lowered his voice and quietly revealed the truth. The approaching ships belonged to the demonic cult. At those words, Ciel Youngi's expression stiffened. Meanwhile, aboard the leading ship of the Murim Alliance fleet, the Alliance leaders stood together while gazing across the enormous lake. The transparent waters of Lake Baikal were so clear and beautiful that many of them momentarily forgot the looming threat of the dragon turtle. Jagal Sohi admired the scenery with genuine fascination. The water was so clear that it felt almost unreal, and she remarked that the place would feel like a paradise if not for the harsh weather and the crisis they had come to face. She then addressed Kang So, the commander of their expedition. However, Kang So did not respond. He continued staring ahead in silence. Despite his lack of reaction, Jagal Sohi continued speaking. She suggested that once they arrived at the Northern Sea Ice Palace, he should ask the acting palace master for a day of rest for the troops. The warriors had traveled relentlessly without proper rest during their journey, and unless the situation was extremely urgent, they would need time to recover their strength. Kang So responded with clear irritation. He reminded Jagal Sohi that he was the commander of the expedition, and that the decision about rest would be his alone, since she had not come as the Murim Alliance's general strategist, but merely as a participant in the mission. He told her to focus on her assigned duties instead. Inside, Jagal Sohi felt anger rising. She thought that it would have been better to ask Moyang Kong instead. Kang So's hostility did not bother her as much as the reckless pace of their journey. The expedition that normally required 15 days had been forced into only 10, leaving the warriors utterly exhausted. Still, she restrained herself and simply told him to do as he wished before turning away. As she walked back toward her cabin, she tried to calm her mind. She scolded herself for becoming angry over something so trivial and suspected that her irritation was simply the result of lack of sleep. Deciding she needed rest, she entered her cabin, planning to take a short nap. At that moment, a loud commotion suddenly erupted from behind the ship. Startled, Jagal Sohi stepped back outside. The noise clearly came from the ships trailing behind them rather than their own vessel. She called out to Moyang Kang. Moyang Kang also sensed that something unusual had happened and suggested that they go and check the situation. Soon the leaders of the Murim Alliance moved toward the rear of the ship to see what had caused such a disturbance. Kang So listened carefully as the shouts of the warriors reached his ears. The soldiers seemed shocked and filled with disbelief. They pointed toward the lake while shouting in amazement. Someone was running across the surface of the water. The person they were seeing was Chun Yewon. Moyang Kang frowned as realization dawned on him and quietly muttered that the technique must be the duckweed water steps. The duckweed water steps was a qigong technique that allowed a martial artist to run across the surface of water. Although it was not as difficult as the legendary void steps, it still required an extremely high level of mastery. Even masters who had reached the evolutionary realm could normally run on water only for a brief moment. Huangbo, the leader of the Huangbo clan, stared at the scene with deep astonishment. Crossing such a vast lake alone was already unbelievable, but something even stranger caught his attention. Every place Yewon stepped upon seemed to calm the water that had been disturbed by the ships. Huangbo could not help but wonder just how powerful Yewon's internal energy must be to control the water in such a way. Moments later, Yewon reached one of the ships carrying the Murim Alliance warriors and lightly stepped onto its deck. Seeing him clearly, Moyang Kong muttered in disbelief that it was cult leader Chun himself. Kang So's face instantly became drenched in sweat as he realized who had appeared before them. The man standing there was none other than Chun Yo-won, the leader of the demonic cult. Yo-won calmly swept his long hair back and spoke with a cold, direct tone, asking which among them was Kang So. Far away on the docks of the Northern Sea Ice Palace, Dan Juchin watched the scene unfolding across the lake. Amazement filled his voice as he remarked that someone from the demonic cult possessed such incredible skill. Confused, Seol Youngi asked what he meant. Dan Juchin explained that a man had just left the demonic cult's ship and crossed half of Lake Baikal using the duckweed water steps. Seol Youngi stared across the lake in disbelief. Inside, confusion filled his mind. The water might have been calm, but crossing half of such an enormous lake was beyond reason. Even the most powerful martial masters of the Northern Sea could not accomplish such a feat. He could not understand how someone had managed it. Dan Jushin also watched the distant figure carefully. A thought suddenly crossed his mind. Perhaps the one approaching was Chun Yujong, the demonic South Master and one of the 5 great martial artists. Because he did not know the latest news circulating through the Jianghu, he had no way of realizing who the man truly was. Meanwhile, aboard the Morm Alliance ship, Dan Jusong stared at Yo-won in disbelief. The man did not look older than 20, yet he was being called the leader of the demonic cult. Moyoung Kang confirmed it calmly. Even if it seemed unbelievable, the man standing before them was indeed the demonic cult leader. Inside, Dan Jusong was stunned. That meant Danbake had truly succeeded in persuading the demonic cult to come. He could hardly comprehend how such a thing had been possible. Moyoung Kang quickly sent a telepathic message to Jigal Sohee, warning her that the situation was dangerous. The demonic cult must have encountered the Great Hung clan. Jigal Sohee immediately realized what he meant. Regret filled her thoughts. When Kang So had schemed with the Great Hung clan, she should have stopped him. But anger over what had happened to Yeon Buso had clouded her judgment. She had allowed the plan to proceed without thinking carefully enough. Around them, the Murim warriors whispered among themselves. Many wondered whether the man before them truly was the infamous demon god, and what they should do if that were the case. Yo-won's gaze finally settled on Kang So. With quiet certainty, he stated that Kang So must be the one. Moyoung Kang urgently sent another telepathic message to Jigal Sohee, warning that Kang So might be in grave danger if they did not intervene. Yo-won was known for showing no mercy to those who raised their fangs against him. He had once killed the Namgung Patriarch without hesitation, even in front of the Murim Alliance head and numerous masters. There was nothing stopping him from killing Kang So here and now. Jigal Sohee quickly replied that she would try to distract him. As Yo-won stepped forward toward Kang So, Jigal Sohee moved into his path. She bowed respectfully and greeted him, introducing herself as Jigal Sohee, the general strategist of the Murim Alliance. However, Yo-won did not acknowledge her at all. His voice remained cold as he ordered her to move aside. Watching the exchange, Dan Jusong was baffled. Jigal Sohee was widely known as one of the 3 most beautiful women in the Jianghu, yet Yo-won showed absolutely no interest or courtesy toward her. Ignoring the cold response, Jigal Sohee continued trying to speak calmly. She asked what had brought him there so suddenly. Yo-won responded with a sharp question, asking if she was pretending not to know. Jigal Sohee instantly understood the meaning behind his words. If he had crossed half the lake alone to confront them, it meant he already knew about their scheme and had come prepared for battle. Her mind raced as she searched desperately for a way to escape the situation. At that moment, Kang So interrupted, declaring that Yo-won was his guest. He told Jigal Sohee to step aside and pushed her away. Jigal Sohee tried to protest, but Kang So firmly ordered her to stop interfering. Inside, she sighed in frustration. This was not the place for Kang So to defend his pride. The man standing before them might very well be the strongest warrior in the entire Jianghu. If Yo-won truly decided to fight, none of them aboard the ship would survive. Kang So carefully observed the man standing before him. Inside his mind, conflicting thoughts clashed. This was the demonic cult leader. The pressure radiating from him was overwhelming, enough to make even seasoned warriors feel intimidated. Yet Kang So's ambition did not waver. If he could eliminate this man, his name would rise above even the Murim Alliance head. Still, he reminded himself not to repeat the mistake Yeon Buso had made. Kang So had already prepared himself to do whatever was necessary to achieve his ambitions. With With that resolve, Kang So suddenly dropped to his knees. He introduced himself as Kang So, commander of the Morim Alliance's Black Shadow Squad. Calmly admitting the truth, he explained that if Yowon's anger stemmed from the encounter with the Great Hung clan, then he had no excuse. It had been Kang So who asked them to stop anyone attempting to follow their expedition. Watching the scene, Mo Yong-kong believed Kang So had made the wiser choice. Though humiliating, bowing before the demonic cult leader was far better than provoking him. However, Yowon slowly drew the white dragon blade. His voice turned cold as he declared that having no excuse simply meant Kang So must pay the price. Sweat instantly soaked Kang So's face as fear crept into his heart. Before Yowon could strike, Jagal Soi stepped forward and interrupted. She reminded Yowon that they were allies and questioned whether he truly intended to harm the leader of an envoy group from an allied organization without even hearing his explanation. Yowon responded without hesitation. There was no need to hear explanations from an ally who had attempted to harm him first. With that, he ordered Kang So to stop wasting his time and accept the consequences. The white dragon blade swung toward Kang So's right shoulder. At that instant, a blade collided with Yowon's attack. Huang Bo had intervened. The impact was so powerful that a gasp escaped Huang Bo's mouth as the bones in his wrist cracked under the force. Yowon looked at him with slight surprise, remarking that he had actually managed to block the strike. Huang Bo declared that Kang So had come to help the Northern Sea Ice Palace and that he could not allow harm to come to him. He refused to cower simply because Yowon was known as the demon god. Gathering his internal energy, Huang Bo forced his bent knee to straighten and prepared to continue resisting, but Yowon had already grown irritated with the constant interference. With a surge of internal energy, he swept his blade again. The force of the attack sent Huang Bo flying backward. His body smashed through the wooden guardrails of the ship before being thrown straight into the icy waters below. Yowon then warned everyone present that no one should interfere again. If anyone tried to stop him, he would no longer show mercy. The warriors of the Black Shadow Squad instantly drew their weapons, forming a barrier in front of Kang So. They declared that if Yowon wished to kill their commander, he would have to kill them first. At that moment, Kang So suddenly shouted for everyone to stop. Before anyone could react, he pulled out his own sword. Without hesitation, he swung it down and severed his own left hand at the wrist. A horrifying scream escaped him as blood poured onto the deck. While struggling through the pain, Kang So quickly pressed his blood points to slow the bleeding. The Black Shadow warriors stared in absolute disbelief. Their commander had just cut off his own hand. Breathing heavily, Kang So spoke through the agony. He admitted that such an act might not calm Yowon's anger. However, their mission was to help the Northern Sea Ice Palace deal with the dragon turtle. He pleaded for time until that situation was resolved. Once the crisis was over, Kang So promised that if Yowon still wished for him to pay for his actions, he would accept whatever punishment awaited him. Inside, Jagal Sohi could clearly understand Kang So's decision. He had severed his own wrist before Chun Yo-won could strike. Although she realized that Kang So had acted fully aware of the pain he would endure, she still felt the plan was far too reckless. Kang So himself had already calculated everything. When Yo-won swung his blade, Kang So had noticed that the strike was aimed at his shoulder rather than his neck. According to rumors surrounding the demonic cult leader, Yo-won usually only severed an arm when he had no intention of killing his opponent. Kang So concluded that Yo-won did not originally plan to take his life. Because of that, sacrificing his own hand was a better outcome than losing an entire arm. Moreover, Kang So believed that Yo-won, as the head of one of the three most powerful organizations in the Jianghu, would not continue the attack after such a public display of submission. Continuing to strike him now would only damage Yo-won's own dignity before everyone watching. Yo-won let out a quiet breath. He admitted that he had never encountered a situation like this before. His original intention had indeed been to sever Kang So's arm, but Kang So had anticipated the strike and cut off his own hand instead. Jagal Soi quickly sent a telepathic message to Mo Yong-kang. It seemed Kang So's gamble had worked, and perhaps they would avoid a fight after all. Mo Yong-kang silently nodded. In his mind, Kang So seemed even more frightening than Yeon Buso had been. At that moment, it felt as though Kang So's patience and cunning might be the only qualities capable of standing against the demonic cult leader. Kang So then bowed his head and thanked Yo-won for his mercy, yet deep within his thoughts, a burning resolve formed. He swore that he would repay this humiliation someday. His hope now rested on the dragon turtle. Ancient records spoke of mythical creatures whose blood and innate cores possessed miraculous power. Consuming such a core or drinking its blood could grant immense strength and even regenerate lost limbs. If he could obtain the core of the four-headed dragon turtle, he might increase his chi enough to rival the 5 great martial artists themselves. There was an old saying that revenge was never too late. In reality, Kang So was the young master of the Blue Heaven Society. He resolved to endure this humiliation if it meant he could one day destroy both the demonic cult and the unorthodox alliance. At that moment, Yo-won suddenly spoke. He posed a question about what one should do if a person plotting revenge tried to escape their grasp. Confused, Kang So asked what he meant. Yo-won calmly explained that he had originally planned to spare Kang So after severing one of his arms. However, after witnessing Kang So's determination and cleverness, he had changed his mind. The realization struck Kang So instantly. His face turned pale. Before anyone could react, the white dragon blade flashed across the air, leaving behind a pale streak. Kang So blinked in confusion, unable to comprehend what had just happened. A moment later, his severed head dropped onto the deck of the ship. His unfinished words died with him. Seeing Kang So's lifeless head lying on the floor with his eyes still open, Jagal Sohee and Mo Yong Kong gasped in shock. Cries erupted across the ship. The warriors shouted Kang So's name in disbelief and anger as they watched their commander and the leader of the Black Shadow Squad die before their eyes. Mo Yong Kang looked toward Yo-won and asked whether killing him had truly been necessary. Yo-won calmly sheathed the white dragon blade. He replied that he had already shown enough generosity. Kang So alone had taken responsibility for a decision that all of them had allowed to happen, ordering the Great Hung clan to attack the demonic cult. Inside, Jagal Sohee realized that Yo-won was warning them not to question his actions any further. By killing Kang So alone, he had chosen not to hold the rest of the Murim Alliance responsible for what had happened with the Great Hung clan. Yo-won turned away after sheathing his saber. He declared calmly that the matter had already been settled. If anyone still had something to say, they could come to him after the affairs of the Northern Sea Ice Palace were finished. However, anyone seeking revenge would have to be prepared to wager their life for it. With those cold words, Yo-won left the ship. The warriors of the Murim Alliance remained silent, watching the direction he had gone until he completely disappeared from sight. One of the warriors carefully picked up Kang So's severed head. Looking at the lifeless face of their commander, he spoke with grief and determination. Kang So, the young master who had once dreamed of a clear blue heaven, had died without even being able to close his eyes. The warrior vowed that he would carry on Kang So's will until the day the demonic cult and the unorthodox alliance were destroyed and the heavens were finally clear and blue. Meanwhile, on the shores of the Northern Sea Ice Palace, Dan Juchin stood silently while staring across the vast lake. Seol Youngi approached him with troubling news. The rumor that the successor had brought the demonic cult leader and other demonic martial artists to the palace had already begun spreading rapidly throughout the Ice Palace. Dan Juchin frowned at the report. The demonic cult had not even arrived yet, but the news was already causing unrest. Youngi explained that because of this, people were no longer paying attention to the fact that the Orthodox Murim Alliance had come to assist them. If the rumors continued to spread, their carefully planned effort to win over the elders and the Palace Master's direct forces might become meaningless. Inside, Dan Juchin felt deeply conflicted. He could not ask the demonic cult leader to leave because the Ice Palace had never officially requested his help in the first place. At the same time, the dragon turtle was still alive, and turning the demonic cult into an enemy now would be extremely dangerous. For a brief moment, he wondered whether they should have tried to solve the crisis alone. But the thought quickly faded. A four-headed dragon turtle was far beyond the power the Northern Sea Ice Palace could handle by itself. Sacrificing the palace's leadership just for the sake of claiming the position of Palace Master would be reckless. In the end, he concluded that it was safer to cooperate for now rather than risk everything. Dan Juchin then spoke aloud, stating that the situation was only temporary. This alone would not be enough to completely shift the balance in the successor's favor. However, Youngi pointed out that many of the elders had already begun paying attention to the successor because of the demonic cult leader's involvement. Frustration filled Dan Juchin as he clenched his teeth. Those meddling elders had always been troublesome, especially ever since he had competed against the former Palace Master for leadership of the Ice Palace. Watching him, Youngi quietly reflected on the situation. This development would force Dan Juchin to recognize the successor as a genuine threat. If he had already chosen the path of a tyrant, he could not afford to hesitate now. Showing pity toward others would only become become a weakness later. The successor might be his nephew and even his former disciple, but removing every obstacle in one's path was the true way of a tyrant. Thanks for watching. Like, share, and subscribe if you enjoyed it. Until next time, happy watching.